The Apache village burned against the night sky, flames consuming dwellings of hide and wood with terrible efficiency. Women screamed as they clutched children to their breasts. Warriors fought desperately, their arrows useless against the rifles of the blue-coated soldiers who moved methodically through the encampment. Captain Jackson Blackwell stood rigid with horror, watching as Colonel Warren Hargrove directed the slaughter with cold precision. The mission briefing had described a camp of hostile warriors. What Blackwell saw instead were families caught unaware in the darkness, their faces twisted with terror as their world collapsed around them. "Sir," Blackwell shouted over the chaos, grabbing the colonel's arm, "these are civilians, women and children. This wasn't the order." Hargrove turned his face, eerily illuminated by the dancing flames. "These savages harbor warriors, Captain, and something far more valuable." He shook off Blackwell's grip. "Follow orders or face court-martial." "What are you looking for?" Blackwell demanded, following, as Hargrove strode through the burning village. "This was supposed to be a measured response to border raids." Hargrove's eyes reflected the firelight with disturbing intensity. "The Apache have something that belongs to my family, something my grandfather sought, and his father before him." He scanned the chaos with calculated focus. A silver shield with ancient markings, small enough to hide, valuable enough to die for. Through the smoke and flames, Blackwell spotted a small figure darting between burning structures. A child no more than 12, clutching something to her chest that caught the firelight. The object gleamed silver in her small hands. "There!" Hargrove shouted, pointing toward the child. "Get what she's carrying!" Two soldiers moved in pursuit. Without thinking, Blackwell drew his sidearm and fired into the air. "Fall back!" he shouted. "Structure's collapsing!" In the resulting confusion, he angled toward where the child had disappeared, ducking through the smoke. By the time he found her near a creek beyond the village, she lay unconscious, blood seeping from multiple wounds. Beside her outstretched hand lay an intricate silver shield small enough to fit in his palm, but etched with symbols of remarkable detail and craftsmanship. Blackwell knelt beside the girl, checking her pulse, faint but present. He quickly tucked the shield into his jacket, gathered the child in his arms, and disappeared into the darkness, deserting his post, his duty, and the man he had once respected. Behind him, Colonel Hargrove's voice cut through the night. Find them both." 15 years later, Arizona Territory, 1885. The arrow stuck out from the barn door like an accusation, its shaft adorned with red and black feathers, colors of the Red Fox Apache tribe. Jackson Blackwell, now 71, stood motionless in the early morning light, his weathered hand hovering over the shaft. Years of frontier life had taught him to read signs others might miss, and this one spoke volumes. He gently removed the arrow, finding the small leather pouch attached to its shaft. Inside was a single eagle feather, a summons. The Apache way of calling someone to meet. Blackwell's eyes drifted to the ridge behind his property, a sense of foreboding settling over him. For 15 years he had lived with the knowledge that someday the past would find him. Perhaps that day had finally arrived. His ranch spread before him 60 acres of decent grazing land, a sturdy 2-story house he'd built with his own hands, outbuildings that had weathered 20 Arizona winters. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with the last of winter's snow, despite it being early April of 1885. It wasn't a grand estate, but it was his, paid for with honest labor and the small inheritance left by his wife, Clara. From a hidden pocket in his weathered leather vest, Blackwell withdrew a worn photograph, Clara young and beautiful, her eyes holding the gentle strength that had first drawn him to her during the war. 20 years gone now, taken by fever during their second winter on this land. Sometimes he still heard her voice on the wind, especially in the quiet hours before dawn. "What would you make of this, Clara?" he murmured, running his thumb over her image. "Signs and portents, just like you always said." The sound of approaching hooves drew his attention. Sheriff Lloyd Reed, his old comrade from the Union Army, rode toward the house, his expression grave even from a distance. At 68, Reed carried his age with dignity, silver hair beneath a worn hat, a neatly trimmed mustache, now more white than gray. His sheriff's badge glinted in the morning sun. "Bad news rides early," Blackwell muttered, tucking away Clara's photograph and moving to meet his friend. Reed dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested such actions. "Jack," he nodded in greeting. "Wish this was a social call." "Your face says otherwise," Blackwell replied. "Coffee's hot." Inside, Reed removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands before extracting an official-looking document from inside his coat. "Notice of foreclosure," he said, placing it on the kitchen table between them. "Victor Hargrove claims you owe his bank $800 for cattle feed and supplies purchased on credit 2 years ago." Blackwell's jaw tightened. "That's horse shit, Lloyd. Never borrowed a cent from Hargrove or anyone else. Pay cash for everything, always have." "I know that." Reed sighed, the lines around his eyes deepening. "But Hargrove has paperwork with what appears to be your signature. Judge Sullivan's already approved the seizure order." He paused, visibly uncomfortable. "I'm required to post this notice. Property seizure scheduled for tomorrow morning." "Hargrove." Blackwell spat the name like something foul. "How many does this make now?" 16 properties in 18 months, Reed confirmed, all legal on paper. "And Judge Sullivan signs off on everything without question." Reed nodded grimly. "And young Dr. Thornton conveniently finds folks mentally unfit when they protest too loudly." "Marcus Thornton," Blackwell frowned. "Old Doc Thornton's boy. Took over his father's practice 3 years ago," Reed said. "Nothing like his old man. Works hand in glove with Hargrove now." A flicker of anger crossed Blackwell's face. He had known the elder Dr. Thornton well, a good man, who had once helped him in a matter of life and death. Edwin Thornton had been one of the few people Blackwell had trusted with his secret, all those years ago when an Apache child lay near death in his home. The boy was always hungry for respect, Blackwell mused, even as a youngster helping his father with house calls. Edwin worried about that. "Well, he's got respect now," Reed said bitterly. "And a fine house in town, new clothes, and a desk at Hargrove's bank where he reviews loan applications when he's not declaring folks incompetent." He sighed heavily. Edwin would be heartbroken to see what his son's become. Blackwell studied his old friend's face. "There's more, isn't there, Lloyd?" Reed hesitated, then nodded. "The Rollins place burned down last month after Hargrove took possession. Thomas Rollins was inside. Ruled accidental, but—" He left the implication hanging. "Murder," Blackwell said flatly. "No proof," Reed cautioned. But Thomas was vocal about fighting the seizure. Had documents he claimed would expose the fraud. Reed's eyes met Blackwell's. The documents weren't found in the ashes. A heavy silence settled between the two old soldiers. Both had seen enough death to recognize its deliberate application. "You've got 24 hours, Jack," Reed finally said, standing up. "Then Hargrove comes with Dr. Thornton to evaluate your mental state, and I'm required to enforce the seizure." His eyes conveyed an apology his position wouldn't allow him to voice. As Reed moved to leave, he hesitated at the door. "Jack, Hargrove specifically asked about that ridge behind your property. Seemed mighty interested in it. Any idea what?" Alarm bells rang in Blackwell's mind, but his expression remained neutral. "Just rocks and scrub up there, Lloyd. Nothing special." Reed studied his old friend's face, then nodded slowly. "Be careful, Jack. Something doesn't sit right about any of this." He lowered his voice. "If you need to reach me tonight for any reason, I'll be at the office late. Not patrolling, just paperwork." The unspoken message was clear. Reed would be available if trouble came before morning. Blackwell nodded his understanding. "Give Margaret my regards," he said, though Reed's wife had been dead for nearly as long as Clara. It was their old signal from the war, a reminder of shared history and loyalty that transcended current circumstances. Reed's eyes softened briefly at the mention of his wife's name, then hardened again with resolve. "I'll do that," he replied, settling his hat back on his head and departing. After Reed's horse disappeared down the trail toward town, Blackwell stood motionless on his porch, the foreclosure notice crumpled in his fist. The arrow from the barn door lay on the railing beside him, 2 messages from 2 different worlds arriving on the same day. It couldn't be coincidence. He moved inside to his bedroom, kneeling before an old trunk pushed against the wall. From beneath layers of clothing and mementos, he withdrew a carved wooden box, its surface worn smooth from years of handling. Inside lay something he hadn't looked at in years. A small, intricately crafted silver shield, no larger than his palm, Apache craftsmanship symbols etched into the metal, telling a story he only partially understood. "The Shield of Justice," he murmured, running his thumb over the ancient symbols. The dying Apache chief, the girl's father, had pressed it into his hands 15 years ago, his eyes intense, even as life ebbed from him. "You saved my daughter," the chief had whispered in surprisingly good English. "For this, I give you what others would kill for. The Shield of Justice carries the truth of our boundaries, the markers of our sacred lands." His bloodied hand had closed Blackwell's fingers around the silver object. "When the shield-bearer returns, justice will follow. Keep it safe until then." Blackwell had never fully understood the meaning of those words, but he had honored the request, keeping the shield hidden all these years. Now it seemed others still sought it, including Victor Hargrove, brother of the man who had ordered the massacre that night. "Hargrove," he muttered, carefully returning the shield to its box. Warren Hargrove had died 10 years ago, killed in a skirmish with Comanche raiders, according to reports. But his younger brother, Victor, had inherited both the family fortune and, apparently, the family obsession with Apache treasures. Blackwell moved to his desk, where he kept his account ledgers, meticulous records of every transaction over the past 5 years. Not a single entry showed any dealings with Victor Hargrove or his bank. The foreclosure was based on fiction, but Blackwell knew that wouldn't matter to Judge Sullivan, who had been in Hargrove's pocket for years. As afternoon waned into evening, Blackwell made preparations. He cleaned his Winchester rifle and checked his revolver. He moved valuables to a hidden space beneath the floorboards. Finally, he gathered dried herbs from his collection knowledge gleaned from the Apache girl during those desperate days of healing her wounds. Among them was snakeroot, a plant that could cause temporary but convincing symptoms: stomach pain, sweating, dizziness. Nothing lethal, but enough to reveal true priorities when confronted with suffering. The sun set in a blaze of orange and purple behind the western mountains. Blackwell sat on his porch, watching darkness claim the land, wondering if this would be his last night on the property he'd called home for 20 years. From inside his shirt, he withdrew Clara's photograph once more. "I tried to build something good here," he told her image softly. Something honest to make up for all the things I couldn't change. He sighed deeply. Maybe some debts can never be fully paid. A sound from the gathering darkness snapped his attention back to the present. His hand moved instinctively toward the rifle leaning against his chair, but something made him pause. This wasn't the approach of someone trying to hide their presence. The footsteps were deliberate, almost ceremonial in their measured pace. "I mean, you no harm," came a woman's voice from the shadows, clear-educated, with just the faintest hint of an accent. "Step into the light," Blackwell said calmly, his finger near the trigger. From the darkness emerged a woman in her late 20s. She wore a practical riding outfit that combined frontier practicality with subtle elements of Apache design. Her black hair was pulled back in a neat braid revealing high cheekbones and intelligent eyes. Most striking was the scar that ran along her left cheek, a healed wound that Blackwell recognized instantly, having tended it 15 years earlier. "My father said you had the soul of a warrior, but the heart of a healer," she said in perfect English, her posture proud but non-threatening. Blackwell's rifle lowered slowly as recognition dawned. "Na Iuchadi?" he asked, using the Apache name meaning dreamer that he had called her during those fever-racked nights. A small smile touched her lips. "They call me Elena Redhorse now." She took another step forward into the pool of light from the porch lamp. "And I've come to repay a debt of honor." For a moment, Blackwell simply stared at this ghost from his past, now standing before him as a grown woman. He remembered her as a broken child, barely clinging to life, as he desperately applied poultices and brewing teas according to her feverish instructions. Now she stood tall and confident, her eyes holding both wisdom and determination that belied her years. "You survived," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "Because of you," Elena replied simply. She gestured to the chair beside him. "May I?" Blackwell nodded, setting his rifle aside. As she settled into the chair, he noted more details, the quality of her clothing, the educated way she carried herself, the subtle blend of two worlds in her appearance and manner. "How did you find me?" he asked. "I never lost you," Elena said. "After the missionary family took me in, I made sure to learn everything about the man who saved my life. Captain Jackson Blackwell, later military legal advisor, then lawyer, then rancher." She tilted her head slightly. "A man who disappeared from his previous life after testifying against Colonel Hargrove." Blackwell's eyes narrowed. "You've done your research." 15 years of it," she confirmed. "While learning both worlds, yours and mine." She glanced at the arrow that still lay on the porch railing. "I see Running Wolf has already made contact." "You know him. He is my uncle, my father's blood brother," Elena explained. "He's been watching over you for years from a distance, honoring my father's last request." Blackwell absorbed this information slowly. "All these years, I thought I'd left that night behind." "Some nights follow us forever," Elena said softly, her hand unconsciously touching the scar on her cheek. "But I haven't come to revisit old wounds. I've come because Victor Hargrove is about to steal your land, just as he stole land from 16 other families, including members of my tribe." "You know about the foreclosure notice," Elena nodded. "Sheriff Reed posted it this morning. But this isn't just about a false debt. Victor Hargrove is the younger brother of Colonel Warren Hargrove." "I know," Blackwell said grimly. "Warren died 10 years ago. Military funeral with full honors, despite what he did to your village." "Yes, heroes are made by those who write the stories," Elena said, a flash of bitterness crossing her face before she composed herself. "But Victor carries on his brother's legacy and his obsession. "The shield of justice," Blackwell said, watching her reaction carefully. Elena's eyes widened slightly. "You know of it. Your father gave it to me before he died," Blackwell admitted. "Said I was to keep it safe until the shield-bearer returned." "My father gave you the shield." Elena's composure cracked momentarily, raw emotion showing through. "I thought it was lost in the attack." "I've kept it hidden all these years," Blackwell said. "Never understood exactly what it was, only that it was important to your people." Elena was silent for a moment, processing this revelation. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, but filled with quiet intensity. "The shield of justice isn't just a tribal relic, Mr. Blackwell. In Apache tradition, it was crafted centuries ago by our most skilled silversmith, guided by visions from the mountain spirits. The symbols etched into its surface aren't merely decorative. They're a map." "A map to what?" Blackwell asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "To sacred sites and boundary markers established long before white settlers came to these lands," Elena explained. "Markers that correspond exactly to the boundaries set forth in the Treaty of 1851, a treaty the government has repeatedly violated. But more than that, the shield leads to a hidden cave in the mountains, where our people stored not just treasures, but historical records, proof of our legitimate claim to lands that have been systematically stolen. And the Hargroves have been seeking this shield for generations," Blackwell said, the pieces falling into place. Elena nodded. "The first Hargrove came west in 1835, a surveyor for the government, ostensibly but actually hunting for Spanish gold, rumored to be hidden in Apache territory. The stories became confused over time. The Apache sacred records transformed in white men's tellings into a treasure cache. When Warren Hargrove attacked our village, he wasn't just following military orders. He was pursuing his family's obsession. And now Victor Hargrove is continuing that pursuit," Blackwell concluded. "Targeting my ranch because somehow he's learned I might have the shield." "The ridge behind your property," Elena said, gesturing toward the dark silhouette visible against the night sky. "It's described in the ancient stories as one of the sacred markers. Apache legend says that when the morning sun strikes a certain rock formation on the summer solstice, it reveals the path to the hidden cave." Blackwell glanced toward the ridge with new understanding. All these years he had lived beside a landmark of profound significance to the Apache people, never knowing its true importance. "How do you know all this?" he asked. "You were just a child when you saved me," Elena finished for him. "After the missionary family took me in, I was sent east for education. Boston, then New York. I learned your ways, your laws, your history. But I never forgot my own." Her expression grew determined. 3 years ago, I returned west and began working for the Department of the Interior, specifically on cases involving native land rights and fraudulent seizures. "From wounded Apache girl to government lawyer," Blackwell said, impressed, despite himself. "Quite a journey." "A journey that began when you saved my life," Elena replied. "You could have left me to die, many would have. Instead, you risked everything to help an enemy's child." "You were never the enemy," Blackwell said quietly. "Just a child, caught in a war you didn't start." A comfortable silence settled between them for a moment. Two people connected by a pivotal night. 15 years in the past, now reunited by new threats from the same source. The silence was broken by a distant sound, a horse moving fast along the trail from town. Blackwell was on his feet instantly, rifle ready. "You expecting company?" Elena asked, her own hand moving to a concealed weapon beneath her jacket. "No," Blackwell said grimly, "and Hargrove isn't due until morning." They watched as a lone rider approached at speed, silhouetted against the starlit sky. As the figure drew nearer, Blackwell relaxed slightly. "It's Daniel," he said. "Works at the general store in town. Good kid." The young man reined in his lathered horse before the porch, breathing hard from the fast ride. "Mr. Blackwell," he gasped, "Mrs. Henderson sent me. Said to tell you Hargroves gathered men at the saloon, offering $50 to anyone willing to ride out here tonight." He glanced nervously at Elena, clearly surprised to find Blackwell had a visitor. "What exactly did Hargrove say, Daniel?" Blackwell pressed. "Said there was an Indian woman headed this way who stole some important papers from his office," Daniel replied. "Said she might try to interfere with official business." He hesitated. "Mrs. Henderson thought you should know. Said she remembered what happened to the Rawlins place." Blackwell nodded grimly. "Thank you. You'd best get back to town now. And Daniel, you never saw the lady here, understood?" The young man nodded. "Yes, sir. Mrs. Henderson said the same." He wheeled his horse around, then paused. "Mr. Blackwell, folks in town, they know what Hargrove's been doing. Not everyone agrees with it, just thought you should know that too." As Daniel disappeared back toward town, Blackwell turned to Elena. "Hargrove's accelerating his plan. He must know you're here and what that means." "It means he's desperate," Elena said calmly, "which makes him dangerous." She stood moving toward the door. "We need to get the shield to safety. If Hargrove's men come tonight—" "Already ahead of you," Blackwell interrupted, leading her inside. He retrieved the wooden box from its hiding place, handing it to Elena. "Take this to your people. The shield belongs with them anyway." Elena opened the box, gazing down at the silver object inside. Her fingers traced the intricate symbols with reverence. "All these years," she whispered, "my father's last gift to our people." "There's more," Blackwell said, moving to his desk. From a hidden compartment, he withdrew a leather portfolio. "Testimonies I gathered after the attack. Soldiers who witnessed Hargrove's true motive statements from traders who saw him searching Apache sites before any military action was ordered. I was building a case against him when he died." Elena accepted the portfolio with surprise. "You were seeking justice even then." "Failed justice," Blackwell corrected. "Warren Hargrove died before he could face a tribunal. But these documents might still matter. They establish a pattern that connects to Victor's current actions." A sound from outside interrupted them, horses approaching, moving quietly, but not silently. Several riders by the sound of it. "Hargrove's men," Blackwell said grimly, moving to extinguish the lamps. "Too soon for Daniel to have reached town, and Hargrove to send men. He must have already dispatched them before Daniel even left." Elena moved efficiently in the darkness, her eyes adjusting quickly. "How many exits?" "Front door, back door, through the kitchen window in my bedroom upstairs," Blackwell replied, checking his revolver. "But they'll have the house surrounded." "Then we don't leave?" Elena said, her voice calm but determined. "We make a stand. My people are camped 3 miles east of here. Running Wolf will have seen these riders pass." "How many warriors does he have?" "Enough," Elena said simply. Outside, the approaching riders had stopped fanning out to surround the darkened house. Blackwell counted at least 6 distinct silhouettes against the starlit landscape. "Blackwell," came a voice from the darkness, cultured, imperious, with the confidence of wealth and power behind it. "I know you're in there, and I know who's with you." "Victor Hargrove," Elena whispered. "He came himself." "This can end peacefully," Hargrove continued. "All I want is what my brother died trying to find. Give me the Apache shield and you keep your ranch. Simple transaction." Blackwell moved to a window, keeping to the side to avoid presenting a target. "Nothing here belongs to you, Hargrove," he called back. "Not the land, not the shield, not the truth." "The truth." Hargrove laughed, the sound cold and brittle in the night air. "The truth is whatever Judge Sullivan says it is. And he says this land is mine, as of tomorrow morning." "Hard to enforce a seizure order on a dead man," Blackwell replied. "Is that your plan? Burn the place with me inside. Make it look like an accident like you did with Rawlins." A tense silence followed. When Hargrove spoke again, his voice had hardened. "Don't be melodramatic, Blackwell. I'm a businessman, not a murderer. But I am also a man who understands value. The shield and the cave it leads to Spanish gold hidden for centuries. Worth more than all the cattle in Arizona." "This isn't about gold," Blackwell called back. "It's about land, Apache land. It's about legacy." Hargrove snapped, his composure cracking. "My brother died trying to secure what rightfully belongs to our family. I won't fail where he failed." Elena touched Blackwell's arm, signaling him to move away from the window. "He's stalling," she whispered, "positioning his men. We need to act first." "What do you suggest?" Blackwell asked. Elena slipped the wooden box containing the shield into her jacket. "Create a diversion. I'll make for the trees beyond the corral. Once I have the shield safely away, I'll bring help." Blackwell nodded, though he disliked the idea of Elena facing danger alone. "Be careful. These aren't soldiers following orders, they're hired guns with money on their minds." "I grew up in two worlds," Elena reminded him with a slight smile. "I can handle myself in both." She removed her revolver, checking that it was fully loaded. "On my signal." Before Blackwell could respond, a flaming arrow arced through the night, striking the roof of the house with a soft thud. Within seconds, several more followed their fiery trails, illuminating the night. "They're burning us out," Blackwell growled, moving quickly to the kitchen. "Change of plans. We leave now together." Elena followed, clutching the wooden box and portfolio. "The back door." "Too obvious," Blackwell said. "Root cellar. Tunnel leads to the old prospector's shack behind the property. Dug it when I first settled here. Clara always said a man should have more than one way out of trouble." He moved a rug aside, revealing a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. As he pulled it open, another flaming arrow struck the house, this one shattering a window and landing on a curtain which immediately caught fire. "Hurry!" Blackwell urged, helping Elena down into the earthen cellar. He followed quickly, pulling the trapdoor shut above them just as the sound of breaking glass indicated Hargrove's men were making their entry. The root cellar was cool and dark, with shelves of preserved food lining the walls. At the far end, partially concealed behind a barrel, a rough-hewn tunnel extended into darkness. Blackwell lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low. "This way," he whispered, leading Elena into the narrow passage. "It's not a comfortable journey, but it'll get us clear of the house." The tunnel was barely tall enough to stand in, supported by timber braces every few feet. It smelled of earth and old wood, the air cool but not stale, indicating it connected to outside ventilation somewhere along its length. "You were well prepared," Elena observed as they moved carefully through the darkness, the lantern casting long shadows. "I've made enemies before," Blackwell replied. "Not just Hargrove. Man who stands against corruption tends to find himself unwelcome in certain circles." Above them, muffled by earth and distance, came the sounds of Hargrove's men searching the house, their frustrated shouts growing more urgent as the fire spread. The tunnel continued for nearly 100 yards, gradually sloping upward, before terminating in another trapdoor. "Old mining shack," Blackwell explained quietly as they reached the end. "Previous owner was a silver prospector, found enough to build the main house, then dried up. Shack's been empty for years, but I keep it maintained. Looks abandoned from outside." He cautiously pushed open the trapdoor, peering into the darkness of the abandoned shack. Satisfied it was empty, he helped Elena up, then followed, closing the tunnel entrance behind them. Through the shack's single dirty window, they could see Blackwell's house in the distance, now fully engulfed in flames. Hargrove's men had formed a perimeter around it, ensuring no escape. "They think we're still inside," Elena said, her expression grim in the faint firelight that filtered through the window. "Let them think it," Blackwell replied. "Gives us time to reach your people." He moved to a corner of the shack, pulling aside some old sacking to reveal a small cache ammunition dried food canteen of water and a second rifle. "Emergency supplies," he explained. Elena nodded approvingly. "You really don't trust easily, do you, Mr. Blackwell?" "Trust is earned," he replied, checking the second rifle. "And hard to come by in this territory." "Yet you trusted me 15 years ago," Elena observed. "A child from an enemy tribe." Blackwell paused, considering. "You weren't an enemy, just a child who needed help." He shouldered the second rifle. "And some decisions aren't about trust. They're about who you choose to be when faced with injustice." A shared understanding passed between them, recognition of how that one night had altered both their lives, setting them on paths that now converged again in the face of a common threat. "We should move," Elena said, peering out the window toward the ridge. "My people are camped beyond that rise. If we stay along the tree line, we can avoid being spotted by Hargrove's men." As they slipped out of the shack into the cool night air, Blackwell cast one last glance at his burning home. 20 years of memories and labor reduced to cinders by a man's greed. Yet strangely, he felt a sense of release. The ranch had been built as an escape, a place to hide from his past. Perhaps it was fitting that it should fall as he finally confronted that past. They moved silently through the darkness, keeping to the shadows of pine and juniper that dotted the landscape. Elena led with surprising confidence, her movements suggesting familiarity with the terrain. "You know these lands well," Blackwell observed quietly as they paused in the shelter of a rocky outcropping. "I've been watching your ranch for weeks," Elena admitted. "Learning the approaches, the hiding places, the patrol patterns of Hargrove's men." "His men have been watching me," Elena nodded. "2 riders rotating every 12 hours, stationed in the hills northwest of your property." She gestured toward a distant ridge. "Professional scouts, former cavalry. They report your movements to Hargrove daily." "You've been thorough," Blackwell said, impressed, despite the uncomfortable realization that he had been under surveillance. "I had to be," Elena replied. "When I began investigating Hargrove 2 years ago, I discovered a pattern of careful preparation before each seizure. He studies his targets, learns their routines, identifies vulnerabilities." "And my vulnerability?" "Your isolation," Elena said simply. "No family, few close connections in town, a history that makes you reluctant to seek help." She glanced at him. Perfect target for a man like Hargrove, someone whose disappearance might not be questioned too deeply. The implication was clear: Hargrove had intended more than simply seizing the property. The fire was meant to eliminate both Blackwell and any evidence of the fraud, just as it had with Thomas Rawlins. They continued on, climbing steadily toward the ridge that separated Blackwell's land from the valley beyond. As they neared the crest, Elena signaled for silence, dropping into a crouch. Blackwell followed suit, his old soldier's instincts responding to her caution. Ahead, Silhouetted against the stars stood a lone figure, tall, motionless, a rifle cradled in his arms. One of Hargrove's scouts positioned to intercept anyone fleeing the burning ranch. Elena signaled her intention to circle around, but Blackwell shook his head. Moving slowly, he unslung his rifle, took careful aim at a cluster of rocks some distance from the scout, and fired a single shot. The crack of the rifle echoed across the hillside, followed by the ping of the bullet ricocheting off stone. The scout reacted instantly, swinging his rifle toward the sound and firing 2 quick shots in response. While his attention was diverted, Blackwell and Elena darted forward, covering the ground between them with surprising speed for their respective ages. Before the scout could register their approach, Blackwell was upon him, the butt of his rifle connecting solidly with the man's temple. The scout crumpled without a sound, unconscious but alive. "Efficient," Elena commented, as Blackwell quickly bound the man's hands and feet with the scout's own belt and neckerchief. "Old tricks from an old soldier," Blackwell replied, retrieving the scout's rifle and ammunition. "He'll have a headache when he wakes, but he'll live." They crested the ridge minutes later, pausing at the top to catch their breath and survey the land beyond. In the valley below, barely visible in the darkness, a cluster of small fires marked the location of Elena's encampment. "My people," she said, relief evident in her voice. "Come, you'll be safe there." As they descended toward the encampment, Elena explained more about her investigation. "For 2 years, I've been gathering evidence against Hargrove. Testimonies from families he's cheated, records of his transaction, samples of genuine signatures that don't match those on his debt claims. But the territorial judge is in his pocket, and without the shield as proof of Apache land claims, it's been difficult to interest federal authorities in the case." "The shield alone won't be enough," Blackwell cautioned. "You'll need more to convince a federal judge." "I have more," Elena assured him, "including a witness who worked in Hargrove's office, a clerk who documented every fraudulent transaction before fleeing with his evidence 3 months ago." "And this clerk is with your people now?" Elena nodded, along with representatives from 16 families who lost their land to Hargrove's schemes. Both settlers and tribal members united against a common enemy. As they approached the encampment, Blackwell was struck by what he saw. This was no typical Apache camp. Warriors from multiple tribes stood guard around its perimeter, not just Apache, but Navajo, Hopi, even traditional enemies like Comanche and Ute. Among them moved settler families, white farmers, Mexican ranchers, a Chinese merchant, and his wife. Children of different races played together near one of the fires, supervised by women who shared food and stories. "You've created something remarkable here," Blackwell observed, genuine admiration in his voice. "Not created," Elena corrected, "revealed. This is what becomes possible when people recognize a common threat and set aside old hatreds." She smiled slightly. "You taught me that, Mr. Blackwell, the night you chose to help an enemy's child." At their approach, an elderly Apache man with long white braids stepped forward from beside the central fire. His face was deeply lined with age, but his posture remained proud and straight. His eyes, dark and penetrating, moved from Elena to Blackwell with keen assessment. "Running Wolf." Elena greeted him respectfully in Apache, then switched to English. "This is Jackson Blackwell." The elder studied Blackwell for a long moment before speaking. "The healer with a warrior's hands," he said finally, his English accented but clear. "My brother spoke of you before he died. Your brother honored me with his trust," Blackwell replied, matching the elder's formal tone. "I've tried to be worthy of it." Running Wolf nodded once, apparently satisfied. "The flames on the mountain tell us Hargrove has made his move," he said, gesturing toward the distant glow of Blackwell's burning ranch. He came early with men and fire, Elena confirmed. He knows I'm here and what it means. Then we must move quickly, Running Wolf said. The shield. Elena produced the wooden box from inside her jacket. With ceremonial reverence, she opened it, revealing the silver shield of justice nestled within. A murmur ran through those gathered nearby, recognition of an object of profound cultural significance, long thought lost. Running Wolf's weathered hand hovered over the shield, not quite touching it. The prophecy, he murmured. When the shield-bearer returns, justice will follow. He looked up at Elena. You have become what your father foresaw. The one who walks in both worlds carrying our truth to those who would deny it. Elena accepted this assessment with quiet dignity. The shield alone isn't enough, she said. We need Hargrove himself to reveal his true motives. Only then will Sheriff Reed have grounds to arrest him, regardless of Judge Sullivan's orders. And how do we accomplish this? Running Wolf asked. Elena turned to Blackwell. The moral test, she said. As we discussed. Blackwell nodded, withdrawing the pouch of snake root from his pocket. We create a situation that forces a choice between self-interest and proper conduct, he explained. When Hargrove and Dr. Thornton come to formally seize the ranch tomorrow, they'll find us waiting for them. Hargrove will be made uncomfortable enough to reveal his true nature. Running Wolf considered this approach. And if words fail, then we have warriors from 7 tribes and witnesses from 16 families to ensure justice by other means. Elena replied, a steely determination in her voice. The elder nodded slowly. It is a good plan. But Hargrove will not come to a burned ranch. He believes you both died in the fire. Then we let him believe that, Blackwell said. Until morning reveals the truth. As the night deepened, the encampment prepared for the coming confrontation. Warriors checked weapons and discussed positioning. Families organized their evidence receipts, correspondents' witness statements. A detailed map was drawn showing the locations of all 16 properties Hargrove had seized, revealing a pattern that followed the ancient Apache boundaries marked on the Shield of Justice. In a quiet corner of the camp, Blackwell sat with Elena Running Wolf and a nervous young man introduced as Michael Collins, the clerk who had fled Hargrove's employ with damning evidence. He'll have men with him tomorrow, Collins warned, fidgeting with a leather-bound ledger that contained meticulous records of Hargrove's fraudulent transactions. Not just Dr. Thornton and the sheriff. Hargrove never goes anywhere without at least 2 guards now. How many properties has he seized in total? Blackwell asked. 23, Collins replied. 16 through false debt, claims 7 purchased under duress from owners who faced other forms of pressure. He opened the ledger to a carefully drawn map. The pattern becomes clear when you see them all marked. He's systematically acquiring land along this line. His finger traced a curve that followed the ridge behind Blackwell's property. The ancient boundary of Red Fox Apache territory, Running Wolf confirmed. As shown on the Shield of Justice. But why? Blackwell pressed. Even if there is Spanish gold, it can't be enough to justify this level of fraud and risk. Collins hesitated, glancing at Elena, as if seeking permission to speak. She nodded encouragement. It's not just gold, Collins said, lowering his voice. 2 months ago, a geological survey team hired by Hargrove confirmed deposits of silver and copper throughout the region, rich veins that follow the ancient boundary line. Hargrove has already negotiated contracts with mining companies in Denver and San Francisco. Once he controls the land, he stands to make millions. And the original treaty boundaries would prevent mining without tribal consent, Elena added, which is why the shield and the cave it leads to are so important. They contain proof of those original boundaries. Proof that would invalidate not just Hargrove's claims, but dozens of other land seizures over the past 30 years, Running Wolf said. Lands worth far more than gold. The scope of Hargrove's scheme and his desperation to find the shield now made perfect sense. This wasn't merely about fulfilling a family obsession or finding legendary treasure. It was about systematically erasing evidence that could prevent a modern-day empire built on stolen land. As midnight approached, Blackwell found himself standing alone at the edge of the encampment, gazing toward the distant glow that marked the remains of his ranch. He felt a presence beside him, and turned to find Running Wolf, his age-lined face, thoughtful in the starlight. "You mourn your home," the elder observed. "Not the house itself," Blackwell replied. "Just what it represented, a fresh start after the war, a place where past sins might be balanced by present good." Running Wolf nodded understanding. "You seek forgiveness." "Maybe," Blackwell acknowledged. "Though I'm not sure for what anymore, for the things I did during the war, or for the things I failed to prevent." "My brother did not give you the shield as payment," Running Wolf said after a moment. "He gave it as recognition. He saw in you what few men possess the courage to stand against your own people when they walk a wrong path." Blackwell considered this. "I didn't stand against them soon enough. Many died because I followed orders I knew were wrong. Yet when the moment of choice came, you chose rightly," Running Wolf countered. "You saved my niece when others would have let her die. You preserved our sacred shield when others would have taken it for greed." He gestured toward the encampment where Apache and settler alike prepared to face a common enemy. "And now you stand with us again when you could have fled." Before Blackwell could respond, Elena approached, her expression urgent. "Riders coming from town," she reported. "Sheriff Reed alone." They moved quickly to the camp's perimeter, where warriors had already alerted to the approaching horsemen. Reed rode slowly, hands visible, clearly aware he was being observed from the shadows. "Jack," he called out. "You out there!" Blackwell stepped forward, rifle lowered but ready. "Here, Lloyd." Relief washed over Reed's weathered face as he dismounted. "Thank God. Saw the fire from town. Thought you might have—" He trailed off, taking in the gathering of tribal warriors and settler families. "What in heaven's name is happening here, Jack?" "Justice gathering," Blackwell replied simply. "Hargrove made his move early, tried to burn us out." Reed's expression darkened. "Just like Rawlins," he muttered. "I knew it." He turned to Elena. "Miss Redhorse, I presume your credentials checked out when I wired the Department of the Interior this afternoon. They confirmed you're investigating land fraud in the territory." Elena nodded. "Sheriff Reed, thank you for coming." "Didn't have much choice after what I learned today," Reed said grimly. He reached into his coat, withdrawing several folded papers. "After you visited the jailhouse, I did some digging in the county records. Found these." He handed the documents to Elena, who scanned them quickly, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "Death certificates," she said, looking up. "Thomas Rawlins, Sarah Jenkins's husband." "7 in all," Reed confirmed. "All owners of properties Hargrove acquired. All ruled accidental or natural causes." He removed his hat, running a hand through his silver hair. "But when you look at the dates and the pattern—" "A systematic elimination of anyone who might challenge his claims," Elena finished. "This is evidence of murder, Sheriff." "Enough for me to disregard Judge Sullivan's orders," Reed agreed. Hargrove needs to answer for these deaths regardless of what paperwork he's filed. Running Wolf stepped forward. "You stand against your own judge?" he asked, studying Reed carefully. Reed met the elder's gaze directly. "I stand for the law, sir. The real law, not the kind that gets bought and paid for." He looked back at Blackwell. "Margaret always said justice matters more than procedure. Took me too long to remember that." The reference to Reed's long-dead wife, her values invoked at this crucial moment, wasn't lost on Blackwell. It represented Reed choosing a side in the conflict that transcended mere friendship or professional duty. "So what happens now?" Blackwell asked. "Hargrove thinks you're dead," Reed replied. "Tomorrow morning he's meeting Dr. Thornton at my office to ride out and formally inspect the accident scene at your ranch. Judge Sullivan's already prepared paperwork, transferring ownership based on your unfortunate demise." "Then we'll be waiting for them," Elena said decisively. "At the ranch," Reed nodded slowly. "I was hoping you'd say that." He surveyed the assembled warriors and families once more. "Though I have to say this is the damnedest posse I've ever been part of." As dawn approached, Blackwell found himself standing amidst the charred remains of his home, surveying the damage in the growing light. The main house was gone, reduced to smoldering timbers and ash. The barn had partially survived its stone foundation and lower walls still intact, though the roof had collapsed. Elena approached, carrying a small bundle. "I found these," she said gently, offering him the items, a charred but recognizable photograph of Clara, the melted remains of a pocket watch, a scorched Bible. Blackwell accepted them carefully, his weathered hands cradling these fragments of his past. "Thank you," he said simply. Around them, preparations continued. Warriors positioned themselves in strategic locations around the property, hidden from casual observation, but ready to emerge when needed. Settler families arranged their evidence in the partial shelter of the standing barn. Sheriff Reed paced the perimeter, checking sightlines and approaches. The sun had just cleared the eastern mountains when dust on the road announced approaching riders. Blackwell, Elena, and Reed took their positions in what remained of the front yard, presenting a united front as three horsemen came into view. Victor Hargrove rode in front, a portly man in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit and derby hat that seemed absurdly formal for frontier Arizona. His face initially set in an expression of satisfied anticipation, frozen shock at the sight of Blackwell and Elena standing amidst the ashes of the ranch. Behind him rode Dr. Marcus Thornton, a thin, nervous-looking young man whose resemblance to his late father was limited to a certain shape around the eyes. He nearly pulled his horse up short at the unexpected tableau before them. The third rider, a hard-faced man with a gun prominently displayed on his hip, maintained his composure better than his employers, his hand drifting casually toward his weapon. "Morning, gentlemen," Sheriff Reed called out his badge, catching the early sunlight. "Bit of a surprise, I expect." Hargrove recovered quickly, his shock transforming into careful neutrality. "Sheriff Reed," he acknowledged. "Mr. Blackwell, and Miss Redhorse, isn't it, from the Department of the Interior?" His eyes narrowed. "I understood there had been an unfortunate incident here last night." "Arson," Blackwell replied bluntly. "Attempted murder." "Shocking." Hargrove said, his tone suggesting anything but shock. "These are dangerous times. Apache raids increasing again, I hear." His implication was clear. He was already establishing a narrative that would blame tribal hostilities for the fire. "Funny thing about that," Reed said conversationally. "No Apache raids reported in this territory for over 2 years, but plenty of accidents befalling folks who've crossed you, Hargrove." A flicker of unease crossed Hargrove's face, quickly suppressed. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Sheriff. I'm here on legitimate business." Mr. Blackwell's debt is non-existent, Elena interrupted, stepping forward with a leather portfolio. Just like the debts you fabricated for 16 other properties you've seized. Dr. Thornton shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Sheriff, this woman has no standing in these proceedings. We have a court order signed by Judge Sullivan, based on fraudulent claims and forged signatures, Elena countered. She turned to Reed. Sheriff, I believe you've reviewed the evidence I've gathered. Reed nodded grimly. 7 suspicious deaths connected to Hargrove's land acquisitions, 16 cases of documented fraud, and testimony from a witness inside Hargrove's organization. He fixed Hargrove with a hard stare. More than enough to suspend Judge Sullivan's orders pending a full investigation. Hargrove's expression darkened. This is absurd. You have no authority to override a territorial Judge Reed. Actually, he does, came a new voice as Michael Collins emerged from the partial shelter of the barn carrying his ledger. When there's evidence of criminal conspiracy involving the judge himself. Hargrove's face went slack with recognition. Collins, he hissed. You miserable little... Your former clerk has provided detailed records of your entire operation, Elena interrupted, including payoffs to Judge Sullivan, instructions to Dr. Thornton regarding which property owners should be declared mentally unfit, and most importantly, the true purpose behind your land acquisitions. Thornton's head snapped up at this alarm evident in his features. What purpose? He asked, glancing nervously between Hargrove and Elena. It was just debt collection, legal foreclosures. Was it, Doctor? Elena asked, fixing him with a penetrating stare. Or were you told these seizures were part of a larger plan, one involving mineral rights and ancient boundaries? I don't know what you're talking about, Thornton stammered, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. He turned to Hargrove. Victor, what is she saying? Hargrove ignored him, his attention fixed on Elena. Whatever Collins told you is the desperate fabrication of a disgruntled employee. Nothing more. Then you won't mind explaining this, Elena said, producing another document, a geological survey map with property boundaries overlaid on mineral deposit indicators. Your own survey team confirmed rich veins of silver and copper following exactly the line of properties you've acquired. Properties that coincide precisely with the ancient Apache boundary line as recorded on the Shield of Justice. At the mention of the shield, Hargrove's composure cracked visibly. Where is it? He demanded, his voice losing its cultured restraint. The shield. My brother died trying to find it. Your brother died after ordering a massacre of innocent people, Blackwell said coldly, including Elena's family, all for your family's obsession with Apache treasures. Not just treasures, Elena added. The shield leads to evidence that would invalidate 30 years of illegal land seizures throughout this territory. Evidence that would threaten mining interests worth millions. Thornton was staring at Hargrove with growing horror. Victor, what have you involved me in? Nothing that concerns you, Doctor, Hargrove snapped. Just do your job. Declare Blackwell unfit as we agreed. As you paid him to do, Collins interjected, opening his ledger to a specific page. $500 for each medical evaluation that supported your claims, plus 20% of proceeds from property seizures. Reed's hand moved to his gun. Dr. Thornton, sounds like you've got some explaining to do yourself. Thornton's face had gone ashen. I didn't know about any killings, he protested weakly. The evaluations were flexible interpretations, but I never agreed to be part of murder. Yet you provided death certificates without proper examination for 7 of Hargrove's victims, Elena said, including Thomas Rawlins, whose body was conveniently cremated before any family member could request a second opinion. Hargrove, seeing his accomplice crumbling, made a desperate gambit. "Enough of this circus," he snarled. "Reed, you're exceeding your authority. When Judge Sullivan hears—" "Judge Sullivan was arrested this morning by federal marshals," Reed interrupted. "Turns out, the Department of the Interior takes a dim view of judicial corruption in territorial land disputes." This news visibly staggered Hargrove. His carefully constructed network of protection was unraveling before his eyes. His hand moved subtly toward his coat, where a bulge suggested a concealed weapon. Blackwell noticed the movement. "I wouldn't," he warned quietly. But desperation had overtaken calculation in Hargrove's mind. With surprising speed for a man of his bulk, he drew a derringer from his coat pocket, aiming not at Blackwell or Reed, but at Elena. "The shield," he demanded. "Now, or I put a bullet in the last of the Red Fox Apache line." Before anyone could react, a single shot rang out from the ridge behind the property. Hargrove's derringer flew from his hand, accompanied by his howl of pain and shock. Blood seeped from a neat wound that had grazed his knuckles without severing any fingers. A warning shot of extraordinary precision. On the ridge stood Running Wolf rifle raised, surrounded by warriors from 7 tribes. More figures emerged from hiding places around the property. The 16 families Hargrove had cheated, each holding evidence of his crimes. "Victor Hargrove," Reed said, formally drawing his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder." As Reed secured the handcuffs around Hargrove's wrists, the banker's face contorted with hatred. "This isn't over," he hissed. "There are powers beyond this backward territory, people who understand what's really at stake." "Perhaps," Blackwell replied calmly, "but those powers aren't here today. Justice is." The morning sun climbed higher over the Arizona mountains, illuminating a scene unprecedented in territorial history. Apache warriors standing alongside settler families united in witness to long-delayed justice. Dr. Thornton, after a moment of indecision, surrendered himself to Reed's custody, his expression that of a man finally confronting the moral bankruptcy of his choices. As Reed led his prisoners toward town, Elena approached Blackwell, the wooden box containing the shield of justice cradled in her hands. "It's over," she said quietly. "The debt is paid." Blackwell gazed at the charred remains of his ranch, then at the gathered people who had helped bring Hargrove to justice, people from different worlds united by a common cause. "No," he said thoughtfully. "I think it's just beginning." Elena followed his gaze, understanding dawning in her eyes. "A new beginning," she agreed. "For all of us." The shield of justice gleamed in the morning light, its ancient symbols no longer hidden, but revealed a testament to truths that had survived 15 years of darkness to finally emerge into the light of justice. 3 days after Victor Hargrove's arrest, the charred ruins of Jackson Blackwell's ranch house still smoldered in places, thin wisps of smoke, rising from blackened timbers that had once formed a home. Standing amid the debris, Blackwell methodically shifted through what remained, searching for anything that might have survived the flames. His weathered hands, marked by decades of frontier life, carefully lifted a scorched Bible from beneath a fallen beam. "The pages are mostly intact," he murmured to himself, gently brushing ash from the leather cover. Clara had read from this book every evening, her voice soft yet resolute in their early years together. Now it was one of the few tangible connections to her memory that remained. A horse approached from the direction of town, the rider moving at an unhurried pace. Sheriff Lloyd Reed dismounted stiffly, his face drawn with fatigue, but bearing a look of satisfaction. "Thought I'd find you out here," Reed said, surveying the destruction. "Most men would have headed to town for a proper bed." Blackwell carefully set the Bible aside. "Never been Most men, Lloyd. Reed nodded, understanding his friend's stubborn independence. Federal marshals took Hargrove to Tucson yesterday. Dr. Thornton's been cooperating, providing detailed testimony about the forged medical evaluations, the bribes to Judge Sullivan, all of it. And Sullivan resigned his position, hoping for leniency. Reed's expression hardened. Won't find much. Territorial governors appointed a special prosecutor to handle the case. The 16 families, meeting with officials today to begin reclaiming their properties, Reed replied. The evidence is overwhelming. Even without the shield of justice, Hargrove's scheme is falling apart like a house of cards. Blackwell nodded satisfaction, mingling with weariness. Justice had been served, but at a cost. 20 years of his life lay in ashes around him, with winter only months away. What will you do now, Jack? Reed asked, voicing the question Blackwell had been avoiding. Before he could answer, another rider appeared, Elena Redhorse, mounted on a paint horse that moved with quiet grace across the land. In the morning light, dressed in practical riding clothes, rather than her ceremonial attire, she appeared younger, though no less commanding in presence. Reed tipped his hat to her as she dismounted. Miss Redhorse, good news from town. The Department of the Interior has officially recognized your investigation. They're sending representatives to review the original treaty boundaries. Elena's face brightened with restrained hope. After generations of broken promises, it's almost hard to believe. Believe it, Reed assured her. Your evidence, combined with Hargrove's confession, has opened eyes all the way to Washington. He glanced between Elena and Blackwell, sensing they might have matters to discuss. I should head back. Paperwork doesn't file itself. After Reed departed, Blackwell and Elena stood in silence for a moment, the weight of recent events settling between them. Finally, Elena spoke. Running Wolf asks about you, she said. He wonders if you'll attend the ceremony tonight. What ceremony? Blackwell asked. To honor those who stood against Hargrove, Elena explained, both Apache and settler. It's important for healing, acknowledging what was lost and what was saved. She looked pointedly at the ruins around them. You lost much. Blackwell shrugged, uncomfortable with the notion of ceremony centered on his actions. Did what needed doing, that's all. Elena studied him with perceptive eyes. Your people have a strange way of diminishing important deeds. In my culture, when someone stands against evil at great personal cost, we honor them. A slight smile softened her expression. Even reluctant heroes. Before Blackwell could respond, the sound of wagon wheels drew their attention. A convoy approached from town, 3 wagons laden with lumber tools and supplies, followed by a dozen riders. At the lead wagon's reins sat Mrs. Henderson, the formidable widow who ran the town's boarding house with young Daniel from the general store beside her. What in blazes? Blackwell muttered. Elena's smile widened knowingly. It seems I'm not the only one who believes in honoring debts. Mrs. Henderson brought the wagon to a halt near what remained of the front porch. A woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and practical clothing, she surveyed the destruction with clinical efficiency. Just as Daniel reported, she declared to no one in particular. She fixed Blackwell with a stern gaze that had intimidated generations of boarders. Well, Jackson Blackwell, stop gawking and come help unload. We've got a house to build before the first snow. Blackwell approached the wagon bewildered. Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate the thought, but save it, she interrupted, climbing down from the wagon seat with surprising agility for her age. Town meeting voted unanimously last night. Hargrove's reign of terror ended because you and Miss Redhorse had the courage to stand up to him. Least we can do is help rebuild what was lost in the process. The blacksmith Peterson approached carrying a heavy toolbox. Got most of the town coming out in shifts. Figure we can have the frame up in a week if the weather holds." Blackwell looked from face to face, seeing determination, and something he hadn't expected: respect, even admiration. These were people he'd kept at arm's length for 20 years, maintaining the careful distance of a man with secrets to hide. Now they stood ready to rebuild his home unbidden and uncompensated. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "Say you'll accept the help," Mrs. Henderson replied practically, "and then get to work. Daylight's wasting." For a moment, Blackwell remained silent, struggling with emotions he rarely permitted himself to acknowledge. Then he nodded once, a gesture of acceptance that seemed to satisfy Mrs. Henderson. "Good," she declared. "Daniel has the plans you filed with the county clerk when you first built. We can match the original layout with some improvements for winter insulation that Peterson suggested." As volunteers began unloading supplies and clearing debris, Blackwell found himself working alongside men he'd known only in passing for 2 decades. There was awkwardness at first, the natural discomfort of strangers thrust into sudden cooperation, but it eased as the work provided common purpose. Elena moved among them with natural grace, helping where needed, translating occasionally when Running Wolf and several Apache elders arrived to observe the proceedings. The tribal leaders watched with cautious interest as settlers cleared blackened timbers and marked out the new foundation. Mrs. Henderson, ever practical, approached the Apache delegation directly. "We could use help with the clay mixture for insulating the north wall," she told Running Wolf without preamble. "Daniel says your people have techniques that work better than what we've been using." Running Wolf's weathered face registered surprise at the directness of her address, then something approaching amusement. He conferred briefly with his companions before replying. "We have methods passed through generations," he acknowledged. "Clay mixed with certain grasses, packed between inner and outer walls. Keeps warmth in during winter, out during summer." "That's exactly what we need," Mrs. Henderson declared. "Would your people be willing to show us?" A moment of tension hung in the air, decades of mistrust and violence between their peoples, making such cooperation seem impossible. Then Running Wolf nodded solemnly. "We will show you," he agreed, "if you will listen." And so began an extraordinary collaboration. Apache elders demonstrated traditional building techniques that had evolved over centuries to withstand the harsh desert climate. Settler craftsmen shared innovations in joinery and woodworking unknown to the tribes. Children from both communities, initially shy with one another, soon played together at the edges of the building site, their natural curiosity overcoming inherited prejudices. By midday, the foundation was cleared and marked with work on the frame beginning in earnest. Mrs. Henderson rang a dinner bell summoning workers to a meal prepared by women from town and supplemented with traditional Apache dishes contributed by the tribal encampment. As people gathered to eat, Blackwell found himself seated between Peterson and Running Wolf, a positioning that seemed deliberate on Mrs. Henderson's part. The conversation began awkwardly, but soon turned to practical matters of construction. "Your people built differently before we came." Peterson observed his question genuinely curious rather than condescending. "Wiki-ups and such. What made those work in this climate?" Running Wolf considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Round shapes resist wind better than square corners," he explained. "And we positioned entrances away from winter storm directions." He gestured toward the foundation outline. "This house faces south. Wise choice." Peterson nodded thoughtfully. "Makes sense. First house Jack built here lasted 20 years without much repair. That's saying something in these mountains." The conversation continued technical aspects of building, providing neutral ground where cultural differences could be bridged through shared practical knowledge. Blackwell, listening more than speaking, caught Elena's eye across the gathering. She smiled slightly, clearly pleased by the unexpected harmony developing between the communities. As the meal concluded, Dr. Marcus Thornton appeared at the edge of the gathering. Unlike his previous appearances in expensive suits, he wore simple work clothes, and his demeanor had lost its former arrogance. The crowd quieted at his arrival, awareness of his role in Hargrove's schemes, creating an immediate tension. Thornton approached Blackwell, directly removing his hat and holding it before him like a shield. "Mr. Blackwell," he began, his voice steady despite the hostile stares, "I've come to offer my help if you'll have it." Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, eyes narrowed. "You've got some nerve showing your face here, Doctor, after what you did." Thornton nodded, accepting the rebuke. "You're right, Mrs. Henderson. I played my part in Hargrove's corruption. There's no excusing that." He looked around the gathering, meeting the accusing stares directly. "But I'm trying to make amends. I've given full testimony to the federal prosecutors. Now I'd like to help rebuild what I helped destroy." "Why should we trust you?" Peterson demanded. "You declared half these people mentally unfit so Hargrove could steal their land." "You shouldn't trust me," Thornton admitted. "Not yet. Trust is earned, not granted." He turned back to Blackwell. "My father helped you once when others wouldn't. I'd like to honor his memory by following his example, however belatedly." The mention of the elder Dr. Thornton, a man widely respected for his integrity, created a momentary pause in the hostility. Blackwell studied the younger man's face, searching for sincerity beneath the shame. "There's heavy lifting to be done," he said finally. "And we could use a doctor on site in case of accidents." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was opportunity, a chance to begin the long process of redemption. Thornton nodded his understanding and moved to where supplies were being unloaded, starting with the humblest tasks without complaint. As work resumed, Elena approached Blackwell. "That was generous," she observed. "Not everyone would have given him that chance." "His father was a good man," Blackwell replied simply. "One of the few who helped me save your life 15 years ago." "I remember little from those days," Elena admitted. "Mostly fever dreams and pain. But I remember hands that were gentle despite their strength." She glanced toward where Thornton worked. Perhaps the son might find his way back to his father's path, given the chance. The afternoon progressed with steady progress on the house frame. Apache and settler worked side by side, initial awkwardness giving way to mutual respect as skills were shared and techniques refined. Children delivered water to thirsty workers, moving indiscriminately between cultural groups with the natural diplomacy of the young. As evening approached, Running Wolf signaled to his people. They gathered their tools and prepared to return to their encampment on the ridge. Before departing, the elder approached Blackwell. "Tonight we honor those who stood against evil," he said. "Both my people and yours. You will come." Blackwell hesitated, uncomfortable with ceremony. "I'm not sure I belong in your sacred rituals." Running Wolf's weathered face creased in a slight smile. "The shield chose you as its keeper for 15 years. You belong." He gestured toward the workers from town. "Bring those who wish to understand. It is time for new beginnings." After the Apache delegation departed, Mrs. Henderson organized the remaining work, assigning tasks for the following day before the townspeople began returning home. She approached Blackwell as the site cleared. "You'll come to town for a proper bed tonight," she stated rather than asked. "I'll stay here," Blackwell replied. "Running Wolf has invited us to a ceremony at the Apache camp." Mrs. Henderson raised an eyebrow. "Us? Anyone who wishes to attend," Blackwell clarified, to honor those who stood against Hargrove. The widow considered this unprecedented invitation. Never been to an Apache ceremony, she mused. Might be educational. She glanced toward the ridge where the tribal encampment stood. What time? Sunset. Blackwell replied, somewhat surprised by her interest. Mrs. Henderson nodded decisively. I'll spread the word. Those who want to attend can gather here first. She fixed him with a stern look. And tomorrow you'll accept a proper bed in town until your roof is on. Even heroes need decent sleep. As the building site emptied, Blackwell found himself alone with Elena in the lengthening shadows of late afternoon. She had worked alongside everyone else throughout the day, her quiet competence earning respect from settlers who might otherwise have remained wary of an educated Apache woman. Your people have built more than house frames today, she observed, looking toward the partially constructed skeleton of the new home. They've built bridges. Not my doing, Blackwell said. No, Elena agreed. But you created the conditions that made it possible. She studied his face in the golden light of approaching sunset. That night, 15 years ago, when you saved a dying Apache girl, instead of leaving her to her fate, you planted a seed. Today, we're seeing the first sprouts. Blackwell felt uncomfortable with such metaphorical flourishes. Just did what needed doing, he repeated his earlier assertion. Elena smiled at his stubborn modesty. You should prepare for the ceremony, she said, changing the subject. It would be appropriate to bring something that represents your connection to this land. What kind of something? An object with personal significance, she explained. Something that ties you to this place and its history. Blackwell thought for a moment, then moved to where he had placed Clara's rescued Bible earlier in the day. Will this do? Clara read from it every night we spent in this place? Elena nodded, satisfied with his choice. Perfect. I'll return at sunset to guide you and any others who wish to attend. As she rode toward the ridge to prepare, Blackwell spent time alone amid the partially framed walls of his new home. The day had brought changes he could never have anticipated, not just the physical rebuilding of his house, but the reshaping of connections long neglected. For 20 years he had lived as an island unto himself, convinced that isolation was the price of his secrets. Now circumstances had forced him into community with unexpected results. Just before sunset, townspeople began arriving, more than Blackwell had anticipated. Mrs. Henderson came with Daniel and several other boarders. Peterson the blacksmith brought his wife and teenage son. Even Dr. Thornton appeared, standing somewhat apart from the others, but clearly intent on participating. Most surprising was Sheriff Reed's arrival with his deputy Hanson. "Didn't expect to see you here, Lloyd," Blackwell commented as the sheriff dismounted. "Official capacity," Reed replied, though his expression suggested otherwise. "Making sure everything stays peaceful." He glanced toward the ridge. "And I admit to some curiosity. 30 years in this territory, never been invited to an Apache ceremony before." As the sun touched the western mountains, Elena appeared riding down from the ridge. She had changed from her work clothes into traditional Apache ceremonial attire, though more subdued than what she had worn for the Shield of Justice ceremony. She surveyed the gathered townspeople with mild surprise. "A larger delegation than expected," she observed. "You are all welcome, but I should explain some aspects of the ceremony before we proceed." The settlers gathered around, as Elena described basic protocols of respect: where to stand, when to remain silent, which parts of the ceremony were participatory, and which were observational only. She emphasized that photography would not be permitted, addressing Daniel, who had recently acquired a camera, and that the ceremonial fire should not be approached without explicit invitation. "This is not a performance or exhibition," she explained. "It is a sacred ritual to which you are being welcomed as honored guests. Your respectful presence is itself part of the ceremony, a symbol of new relationships between our peoples." With these guidelines established, Elena led the group up the trail toward the ridge. Blackwell found himself walking alongside Dr. Thornton, who seemed uncharacteristically nervous. "Never thought I'd be invited to something like this," the young doctor admitted quietly. "Feeling out of place?" Blackwell asked. Thornton nodded. "After everything that happened, everything I did." He trailed off, then continued with difficulty. "Father spoke of the Apache with respect, said they had medical knowledge white doctors would do well to study. I dismissed it as sentimentality." He shook his head ruefully. "Just another way I failed to honor his legacy." "You're here now," Blackwell observed. "That's a start." As they crested the ridge, the Apache encampment came into view. It was not the traditional arrangement of wickiups that many settlers might have expected, but rather a hybrid of cultural elements. Traditional dwellings stood alongside canvas tents, with a large central clearing where a ceremonial fire burned. Warriors stood at the perimeter, not threatening, but alert their presence, a reminder that trust remained fragile despite the day's cooperation. Running Wolf awaited them at the entrance to the camp, dignified in ceremonial attire that emphasized his status as a tribal elder. Beside him stood representatives from the other tribes who had joined the coalition against Hargrove, Navajo Hopi, Ute Comanche Pima, and Zuni, each in their traditional dress. "Welcome," the elder greeted them formally. "Tonight, we honor courage that stands against evil wisdom that bridges divided peoples and sacrifice that opens new paths." He gestured toward the central fire. "Please join our circle as guests and witnesses." The settlers followed, tentatively aware they were experiencing something few white people had ever been invited to observe. They were guided to places in an outer ring around the fire, while tribal members formed an inner circle. The seating arrangement was clearly symbolic, separate, but connected with the fire at the center, binding all present. Once everyone was settled, Running Wolf spoke again, first in Apache and then in English for the benefit of their guests. "For generations, our peoples have faced each other as enemies. Blood has been spilled on both sides. Grievances have deepened with each passing season." He gestured toward Blackwell. "Yet 15 years ago, one man chose differently, to save rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm." Blackwell shifted uncomfortably as attention focused on him, unused to such public recognition. Running Wolf continued his storyteller's voice, weaving the narrative with practiced skill. "The child he saved has returned as a woman of wisdom and courage." The elder acknowledged Elena with a respectful nod. "The shield he protected has been returned to its sacred resting place, and the enemy who sought to destroy both peoples through greed and deception has been defeated through our united strength." Tribal drummers began a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the heartbeats of those present. Running Wolf moved around the circle, offering a mixture of herbs to the fire that released fragrant smoke into the evening air. "Tonight we cleanse the past," he intoned, "not to forget but to heal, not to erase but to build upon." What followed was a ceremony of remarkable complexity and beauty. Tribal dancers performed traditional movements that told stories of creation, conflict, and renewal. Songs in multiple indigenous languages filled the night air, their meanings unclear to the settlers, but their emotional power undeniable. Throughout the ceremony, tribal elders incorporated elements that acknowledged the settler presence, inviting Mrs. Henderson to place a pinch of herbs on the fire at one point, asking Sheriff Reed to stand as witness during another segment. These inclusions were clearly unprecedented, their significance evident in the surprised but approving expressions of the tribal participants. Most moving was a segment where Running Wolf called both Blackwell and Elena to the center of the circle. He presented each with a woven bracelet of red and black threads, colors of the Red Fox Apache tribe. "These threads bind our stories together," he explained as they placed the bracelets on each other's wrists. "Not to erase our differences, but to acknowledge our shared path forward." The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. This was not merely a ceremony honoring past actions, but a deliberate creation of new bonds between communities long divided by suspicion and violence. As the ceremonial portion concluded, the atmosphere lightened. Food was shared, traditional dishes from both cultures arranged side by side. Conversation began hesitantly, but gradually warmed as cultural barriers lowered through the universal language of hospitality. Blackwell found himself approached by tribal members who wanted to share memories of the land before white settlement, stories of hunting grounds and sacred sites that had been within his property boundaries without his knowledge. Rather than asserting possession, they spoke of shared stewardship, of teaching future generations to honor the land's history while respecting its present use. Across the gathering, Dr. Thornton engaged in earnest conversation with a tribal healer, their discussion animated despite language barriers. Mrs. Henderson exchanged recipes with Apache women, while Daniel sketched the scene in his notebook, having respectfully left his camera behind as requested. Sheriff Reed stood somewhat apart, watching the unprecedented mingling with an expression that mixed wonder and wariness. Elena approached him, having observed his isolation. "Concerned, Sheriff?" she asked quietly. Reed shook his head slowly. "Amazed, more like. 30 years in this territory, I never thought I'd see Apache and settler breaking bread together like this." He glanced at her. "Think it will last beyond tonight?" "That depends on all of us," Elena replied. "Ceremonies create possibilities, but daily choices sustain them." "Hargrove isn't the only one who'll oppose this," Reed warned. "There are powerful interests that prefer our peoples divided." "We know," Elena acknowledged, "which is why tonight matters so much. We're creating witnesses on both sides, people who have seen another way is possible." As the evening progressed, Running Wolf gathered a small group including Blackwell, Elena Reed, Mrs. Henderson, and Dr. Thornton slightly away from the main gathering. His expression had grown serious. "There is another matter we must discuss," he said once they were seated. "Hargrove's capture is significant, but the threat to our lands continues." "What do you mean?" Reed asked. Running Wolf produced a folded paper from within his ceremonial garments. "This arrived at the trading post yesterday, addressed to tribal leaders." He handed it to Elena, who unfolded and read it quickly, her expression darkening. "The Western Mining Consortium," she explained for the others' benefit. "They're claiming rights to mineral exploration throughout the territory, including lands covered by the original Apache treaties." "On what grounds?" Reed demanded. "Federal mining laws from 1872, Elena replied, "which they interpret as superseding tribal treaties." She looked at Running Wolf. "They've been waiting for Hargrove to secure the land before moving in with their operation. Now they're attempting to bypass him entirely." "Can they do that?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "Legally, no," Elena said. "The treaties explicitly protect subsurface rights, but they're counting on overwhelming legal resources and territorial officials willing to look the other way." Dr. Thornton leaned forward. "Hargrove mentioned the consortium several times in private. They funded much of his operation, expecting preferential access once he secured the properties." This revelation created a moment of tense silence. The victory they had celebrated suddenly seemed incomplete. Hargrove defeated, but more powerful interests waiting in the wings. So we face a new enemy. Blackwell observed, his voice calm despite the implications. One that fights with lawyers and politicians instead of guns. Yes, Running Wolf confirmed. But we also have new strengths. He gestured toward the mingling communities around the fire. Unity that did not exist before. Knowledge of both worlds. He nodded to Elena. And evidence that can stand in territorial courts. The shield of justice, Elena explained. Its markings precisely match the boundary descriptions in the original treaties. Combined with the geological surveys Hargrove commissioned, which Thornton has provided to federal investigators, we can prove both the legitimacy of tribal claims and the consortium's awareness that they were violating those claims. Mrs. Henderson straightened, her practical nature asserting itself. So we continue building. Not just Mr. Blackwell's house, but bridges between our communities. She fixed Running Wolf with a direct gaze. Your young people should learn to read legal documents. Ours should learn the history of this land. Both sides need what the other knows. The elder's weathered face creased in a rare smile. Wisdom from unexpected sources, he acknowledged. This is how new paths are found. The conversation turned to practical matters, legal strategies, documentation of boundaries, education initiatives that might prepare both communities for the challenges ahead. It was no longer just about Blackwell's personal stand against Hargrove, but about a larger struggle for justice that would require sustained cooperation across cultural divides. As the discussion concluded, the group rejoined the main gathering where something remarkable was occurring. Apache children were teaching settler children a traditional game involving patterned stones, while adults from both communities watched with cautious approval. The invisible barriers that had separated these peoples for generations seemed momentarily permeable, allowing genuine human connection to flow between worlds long divided. Elena found Blackwell observing this scene with quiet attention. "What are you thinking?" she asked, noting his contemplative expression. "That Clara would have loved this," he replied softly. "She always said the greatest borders were the ones in our minds." He touched the woven bracelet on his wrist. 15 years ago, I helped one child because it was the right thing to do. Never imagined it would lead to this." Individual actions create ripples that become waves, Elena observed. Your choice that night shaped my life, which in turn has shaped others. She gazed at the mingling communities. Now we're seeing possibilities that neither of us could have imagined alone. As the evening drew to a close, Running Wolf called for attention once more. "Tonight, we have shared food stories and purpose," he announced to the gathered people. "Tomorrow, we return to building not just a house for one man, but understanding between our peoples." He looked specifically at the settlers. "Those who wish to learn our ways are welcome to return. Those who can teach skills we need are invited to share them." It was an extraordinary invitation, an opening of tribal knowledge and practices that had been carefully guarded for generations. The significance wasn't lost on the townspeople, whose expressions ranged from surprise to thoughtful consideration. Mrs. Henderson, ever practical, was the first to respond. "I'll bring more women tomorrow to learn your clay mixing techniques," she declared. "And I can show your young people how to preserve fruits for winter without sugar, if that would be useful." Other settlers followed her lead, offering specific skills or expressing interest in learning tribal crafts. The exchange was tentative, but genuine, the beginning of what might become meaningful collaboration if carefully nurtured. As the gathering dispersed, settlers making their way back down the trail toward town. While tribal members returned to their dwellings, Blackwell found himself lingering with Elena near the ceremonial fire now burning low. "You've changed," she observed. "When I arrived 3 days ago, you were a solitary figure, determined to face Hargrove alone. Now you're at the center of something much larger." Blackwell considered this assessment. "Not by choice," he admitted. "Circumstances forced me into community." "Yet you've embraced it," Elena pointed out. "Accepted help, attended ceremonies, built connections that wouldn't have seemed possible a week ago." "Perhaps at 71, a man gets tired of standing alone," Blackwell said, more to himself than to her. He gazed into the embers. "Or perhaps Clara was right all along. We're not meant to face the world in isolation, no matter how many secrets we carry." Elena studied him in the firelight, noting how the flames illuminated the deep lines of his face, each representing experiences that had shaped him over 7 decades of a life lived largely alone. "Will you stay?" she asked. "After your house is rebuilt?" "Where else would I go?" Blackwell replied, with a slight smile. "This land is mine, paid for with honest work and 20 years of care." His expression grew more serious. "Though I understand now that mine means something different than I once thought." "How so?" "Ownership without stewardship is empty," he said, slowly articulating concepts that had been forming in his mind throughout the day's experiences. "This land was Apache hunting ground long before I built on it. Will be something else long after I'm gone. My claim is temporary, a responsibility more than a right." Elena nodded, pleased by this perspective. "That understanding is rare among your people. Most see land as something to own completely, to bend to their will, without regard for its history or future. Most haven't had their preconceptions burned to the ground," Blackwell observed wryly, gesturing toward the valley where his destroyed ranch lay partially rebuilt. "Loss has a way of clarifying what matters." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the last flames flicker among the embers. Finally, Elena spoke again, her tone carefully neutral. "I've been offered a position as liaison between tribal councils and territorial authorities," she said. "Based in the county seat, but requiring regular travel throughout the region." "Sounds important," Blackwell observed, feeling an unexpected tightness in his chest at the thought of her departing. "When would you start?" "That depends," Elena replied, her dark eyes meeting his. "The position begins in 1 month, but there's much to do before then, documenting boundaries, gathering testimonies, preparing legal challenges to the mining consortium." She hesitated briefly. "I would need a base of operations nearby." Blackwell absorbed her meaning slowly. "The new house will have a spare room," he offered. "Simple but private. Yours for as long as needed." "Thank you," Elena said, a small smile touching her lips. "It would be appropriate. The shield bearer, working from the home of the former shield keeper." "Appropriate," Blackwell agreed, the word encompassing more than either chose to articulate directly. At their ages and positions, he a 71-year-old settler, she a 27-year-old Apache leader, certain possibilities remained unspoken, yet mutually acknowledged. "We should join the others," Elena suggested after another moment of silence. "Running Wolf has offered shelter in the tribal camp until your roof is completed." Blackwell nodded, though he felt a reluctance to leave this quiet moment by the dying fire. Something significant had shifted between them, not just in their personal connection, but in their understanding of the path ahead. What had begun as a debt of honor had transformed into something more profound, a shared vision of justice that transcended cultural boundaries. As they made their way toward the tribal dwellings, the night sky above them blazed with stars, unchanging witnesses to the human dramas unfolding beneath their eternal light. The same stars had watched over a dying Apache girl, and a desperate settler 15 years earlier, their unlikely connection now blossoming into possibilities neither could have imagined during that fateful night. The debt of honor, begun in bloodshed and survival, was evolving into something more lasting and significant, a foundation upon which two peoples might build a future of mutual respect and shared purpose. And in that evolution lay the true power of the shield of justice, far beyond any territorial boundaries it might define. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Legal battles with the mining consortium, continued rebuilding of Blackwell's home, the delicate nurturing of fragile trust between communities long divided. But tonight, in the aftermath of ceremony and connection, those challenges seemed less daunting than they had just days before. For Jackson Blackwell, who had lived most of his life in self-imposed isolation, the path ahead offered something he had long ago resigned himself to: living without belonging. Not just to a place or a community, but to a purpose larger than himself, a legacy that might endure long after the name Blackwell was forgotten in these mountains. And in that realization, he found an unexpected peace. Dawn broke over the eastern mountains, bathing the valley in golden light that seemed to transform even the most ordinary features of the landscape. Jackson Blackwell stood on the porch of his newly completed house, a steaming cup of coffee warming his weathered hands against the autumn chill. 1 month had passed since the ceremony that returned the Shield of Justice to its ancestral resting place, a month that had changed the small frontier community in ways few could have imagined. His new home stood on the same foundation as the original, but embodied the unprecedented collaboration between settler and Apache that had emerged in the wake of Hargrove's defeat. The north wall incorporated the traditional clay and grass insulation technique that kept the interior remarkably comfortable despite the season's fluctuating temperatures. The roof featured Peterson's improved truss design that would withstand the heavy mountain snows. Most striking was the covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides wider than before, with hand-carved posts that subtly combined settler craftsmanship with Apache symbolic motifs. Inside, Elena Redhorse had established herself in the east-facing room, transforming it into a working office filled with maps, legal documents, and correspondence related to her role as tribal liaison. For 3 weeks now, she had conducted her affairs from this base, riding frequently to the county seat or to meetings with tribal elders throughout the territory. Their arrangement remained strictly proper, necessary collaborators in the ongoing struggle to protect tribal lands from corporate exploitation. Yet, Blackwell found himself increasingly aware of her presence in ways that transcended their professional alliance. The quiet rustle of papers late into the night, the scent of sage that lingered after her morning rituals, the measured cadence of her voice as she rehearsed arguments for upcoming legal proceedings, these had become part of the rhythm of the house, filling a silence that had persisted for 20 years since Clara's passing. "You're up early," Elena observed, stepping onto the porch with her own cup of coffee. In the morning light, dressed simply in a practical riding skirt and white blouse, she appeared younger than her 27 years, though her eyes held the weight of responsibilities far beyond her age. "Old habits," Blackwell replied with a slight shrug. Like many frontier dwellers who had survived decades in harsh territory, he maintained the discipline of rising before dawn, a practice born of necessity that had become ingrained long after the immediate dangers had passed. "You're prepared for today." Elena nodded, her expression growing more serious. "As much as possible. Judge Mitchell has reviewed our initial documentation but wants formal testimony regarding the sacred cave and its relationship to the original treaty boundaries." She sipped her coffee, gazing toward the distant mountains. "It's unprecedented, a territorial judge giving serious consideration to tribal claims over mining interests." "Mitchell's always been fair-minded," Blackwell observed. But he's also practical. The Western Mining Consortium represents significant economic potential for the territory. Which is why today's hearing is so crucial, Elena agreed. If we can establish legal precedent for tribal consultation before mining operations begin, it changes the balance of power throughout the territories. She studied him over the rim of her cup. You'll join us. Before Blackwell could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Sheriff Reed was riding up the trail, accompanied by a man they didn't recognize, tall, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Both men rode quality horses and carried themselves with the alertness of experienced frontiersmen. "Lloyd's early," Blackwell commented, setting his coffee aside, "and bringing company." As the riders approached, Reed raised his hand in greeting. "Morning, Jack, Miss Redhorse," he called. "Hope we're not interrupting your breakfast." "Just coffee," Blackwell assured him, studying the stranger with professional assessment. The man was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair cut military short and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years under harsh sun. His clothing was frontier practical, but of good quality, and he wore a sidearm with the casual competence of someone who'd used it professionally rather than merely for personal protection. "Allow me to introduce Marshal Robert Callahan," Reed said as they dismounted. "Federal Marshal's Office Territorial Division. Marshal, this is Jackson Blackwell and Miss Elena Redhorse, Department of Interior Liaison." Callahan approached with direct confidence, extending a hand first to Blackwell, then to Elena. His handshake was firm, but not domineering, the gesture of a man secure in his authority without need to assert it unnecessarily. "Mr. Blackwell, Miss Redhorse," he acknowledged. "I've heard a great deal about you both in the past week." His voice carried the slight rasp of someone who'd once shouted commands over gunfire and never fully recovered the smoothness of youth. "Some of it rather extraordinary." "In what way?" Elena asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Tales of Apache warriors and frontier settlers working together to stop illegal mining operations," Callahan replied with a hint of dry humor. "Federal imposters being captured mining conspiracies exposed ancient shields protecting tribal boundaries." He shook his head slightly. "Sounds like dime novel material, except the department takes it seriously enough to dispatch senior marshals to investigate." "It's all documented," Elena assured him, gesturing toward the house. "We have photographs, testimonies, seized consortium papers. Would you care to review them?" "That's why I'm here," Callahan confirmed. "Judge Mitchell requested federal oversight given the potential precedent-setting nature of today's hearing. The department wants to ensure all evidence meets federal standards before ruling on tribal boundary claims." They moved inside to Elena's office, where documentation of the past month's events had been meticulously organized. Maps of the disputed territories were pinned to one wall, with overlays showing original treaty boundaries, current property lines, and the consortium's proposed mining sites. Photographs, testimonies, and legal briefs occupied a large table, arranged chronologically to present the complete narrative from Hargrove's initial fraudulent land seizures through the consortium's attempted mining operations. Callahan examined these materials with professional thoroughness, asking occasional clarifying questions, but primarily listening as Elena presented their case. Blackwell observed the marshal's reactions, noting his particular interest in the documentation of the fake investigator Calloway's collaboration with mining officials. "This man claimed federal authority while working for private interests," Callahan said, studying the photograph Elena had taken at the mining camp. "A serious federal offense beyond the territorial issues at stake." "He also orchestrated Hargrove's death in custody," Reed added. "Though proving that connection has been challenging," Callahan nodded grimly. "Not surprising. The consortium's lawyers in San Francisco have already distanced themselves from both Hargrove and Calloway, claiming they were independent contractors operating beyond their authorized parameters. He returned the photograph to its place, a convenient fiction that protects the company while sacrificing their agents. "Will that defense succeed?" Elena asked, concern evident in her voice. "At the corporate level, possibly," Callahan conceded. "These organizations are adept at insulating themselves from legal consequences. But the individuals involved, including Callaway and the mining engineers, photographed on tribal land, remain personally liable for their actions." He turned his attention to the map showing the original treaty boundaries. "The shield of justice you've mentioned, it corresponds with these markers." Elena nodded. "The shield bears ancient symbols that align precisely with natural features marking the traditional boundaries. When overlaid with the original treaty documents from 1851, they match exactly. And this shield is now secured in a cave within tribal territory." "Yes," Elena confirmed. "Returned to its traditional resting place after 15 years in Mr. Blackwell's safekeeping." Callahan turned to Blackwell with renewed interest. "That's a story I'd like to hear more about. How did an Apache sacred object come into your possession for 15 years? The question was asked with professional curiosity rather than accusation, but Blackwell felt the weight of his past pressing upon him nonetheless. For 20 years, he had maintained careful silence about the events that brought him to this territory, the night of violence from which he had rescued a wounded Apache child, the dying chief's entrusting of the sacred shield to his care, his desertion from military service to protect both. "It's a long story," he said finally, "one that begins with a military action against an Apache village 15 years ago." He met Callahan's gaze directly. "An action I was part of until I saw what it truly was and made a different choice." Understanding dawned in Callahan's eyes, the recognition of one former military man by another. "You were there when Colonel Warren Hargrove attacked the Red Fox Apache settlement. It wasn't a question, but a statement delivered with the certainty of someone connecting facts previously known separately." Blackwell nodded once, confirmation enough for a man who understood the weight of such acknowledgments. "I was Captain Blackwell then," he said quietly, "military legal advisor attached to Hargrove's command. The operation was presented as a measured response to border raids, but it was actually Hargrove's personal obsession with finding the shield and the treasures he believed it would lead to." Elena had gone very still during this exchange, her eyes on Blackwell with an intensity that suggested she was learning aspects of his involvement she hadn't fully understood before. "When I realized the true nature of the attack, civilians being slaughtered for Hargrove's private agenda, I tried to intervene," Blackwell continued. "When that failed, I made a choice. I found a wounded child in the aftermath, saved her life, and disappeared with her and the shield Hargrove sought." "Desertion," Callahan observed, his tone neutral, stating fact rather than passing judgment. "Yes," Blackwell acknowledged without flinching. "I deserted my post, my commission, and my former life. Brought the child to safety with a missionary family, then established myself here under my real name. Remote enough that military authorities wouldn't bother searching close enough to Apache territories to honor my promise to protect the shield until it could be returned to its rightful guardians." Callahan absorbed this information with the measured consideration of someone accustomed to weighing complex moral decisions against legal frameworks. "The wounded child was you," he said to Elena, completing the circle of connection. "Yes," she confirmed softly, "though I remember little of that night, mostly fever dreams and pain. What I know comes primarily from what others have told me, and from documentation I gathered years later during my investigation of Warren Hargrove's actions." Callahan turned back to Blackwell. You do realize you've just confessed to a federal offense, desertion during conflict, carries significant penalties, even 15 years later. I'm aware, Blackwell replied steadily, but at 71, with the truth finally emerging about Hargrove's illegal actions, the consequences seem less important than they once did. Reed, who had been silent during this exchange, stepped forward. Marshal, surely the circumstances. Callahan held up a hand, stopping Reed's intervention. The statute of limitations on desertion is complex, particularly in cases involving ethical objections to illegal orders. He studied Blackwell with careful assessment. The department may be more interested in your testimony against the Hargrove family's activities than in pursuing charges for actions taken to prevent civilian casualties. The implied possibility of immunity hung in the air, not a promise, but a consideration that suggested Callahan saw the larger picture beyond strict application of military code. "I'll testify to whatever is needed," Blackwell said. "The full truth about that night and everything that followed." Callahan nodded, seeming satisfied with this response. "For now, let's focus on today's hearing. Judge Mitchell needs clear evidence of the relationship between the shield, the sacred cave, and the treaty boundaries. Without undermining tribal privacy, can you provide that?" Elena exchanged glances with Blackwell before responding. "We've consulted with Running Wolf and the tribal elders. They've authorized limited documentation that establishes the legal connections without exposing sacred knowledge. I can present this at the hearing." "Good," Callahan approved, "because the consortium's lawyers will be looking for any procedural weakness to exploit. They've brought in Ephraim Bentley from San Francisco, one of the most effective corporate attorneys in the territories." Reed grimaced at this news. Bentley's reputation precedes him. 3 territorial judges have resigned rather than face him in court. "Mitchell's made of sterner stuff," Callahan observed, "but he'll need irrefutable evidence to withstand the pressure Bentley will bring to bear, both legal and political." As they finalized preparations for the hearing, a rider approached at speed from the direction of town. Dr. Marcus Thornton reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, his expression urgent, despite his still healing injuries. "Sheriff," he called to Reed, "consortium representatives arrived on the morning train. Not just lawyers, mining engineers, and security personnel. At least 20 men well armed." Reed frowned. "Judge Mitchell's hearing isn't scheduled until noon." "What are they doing?" "Organizing an expedition," Thornton replied, dismounting carefully to favor his injured shoulder. "I overheard them at the hotel. They're planning to establish presence at the proposed mining sites before the hearing begins, creating facts on the ground, regardless of legal rulings." Callahan's expression hardened. "A common tactic. Once operations are physically established, courts are reluctant to order their dismantling, even if the original entry was questionable." "They're heading for the ridge," Thornton added, looking toward the mountains. "The same area where the sacred cave is located." Elena exchanged alarmed glances with Blackwell. "If they find the cave before the hearing, they could damage or destroy evidence crucial to establishing the treaty boundaries," Blackwell concluded grimly. Callahan made an immediate decision. "This changes our approach. Sheriff, how quickly can you organize a legal posse to intercept this unauthorized expedition?" "Most of my deputies are already in town preparing for the hearing," Reed replied. "I could have 6 men ready to ride within the hour." "Not enough against 20 consortium men," Blackwell observed, "and not enough time to prevent their access to the ridge." "We need Running Wolf and his warriors," Elena said firmly. "They know the approaches to the sacred mountains better than anyone and can intercept the consortium party before they reach sensitive areas." Callahan considered this suggestion with evident reservation. Apache warriors intervening against white settlers even in defense of tribal lands, creates significant legal complications. If violence occurs, it could undermine your entire case. Not if they're deputized, Reed suggested unexpectedly. Territorial law allows me to deputize citizens in emergency situations. Nothing specifies they can't be Apache citizens. The innovative legal interpretation caught everyone by surprise. Callahan rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Unprecedented, but potentially valid. Would Running Wolf agree to such an arrangement? For protection of the sacred cave, yes, Elena said with certainty. But we need to move quickly. I can ride to the tribal encampment immediately while you organize your deputies, Sheriff. Plans formed rapidly. Elena would alert Running Wolf while Reed gathered his deputies. Blackwell, Thornton, and Callahan would ride directly to the ridge to monitor the consortium's movements until reinforcements arrived. With coordination established, they separated to their assigned tasks, the urgency of the situation overriding further discussion. As they prepared to depart, Blackwell found himself alone with Elena for a brief moment as she saddled her horse. The morning sun highlighted the determination in her features, transforming her from government liaison to warrior with the simple act of purpose. "Be careful," he said quietly. "The consortium has already demonstrated they are willing to eliminate obstacles by any means necessary." Elena paused in her preparations, studying him with an expression that contained more than professional concern. "You as well," she replied. "We still have much to accomplish together." The simple statement carried weight beyond its surface, meaning an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them, transcending their initial connection through the shield, and extending into a shared vision for the future of this contested land. As Elena rode toward the tribal encampment, Blackwell joined Callahan and Thornton for the journey to the ridge. The federal marshal had revealed little of his personal thoughts during their earlier discussions, maintaining professional reserve while absorbing the complex situation he had entered. Now, as they rode side by side, Callahan broke his silence. "You've chosen an interesting retirement, Captain Blackwell," he observed dryly. "Most men your age seek quieter pastimes than confronting mining consortiums and protecting tribal artifacts." "Never been much for fishing," Blackwell replied with equal dryness. A hint of a smile touched Callahan's weathered face. "I served with Warren Hargrove briefly during '68, he said, referencing the post-Civil War conflicts with tribal nations. "Always struck me as a man who confused personal ambition with military necessity. Made me uncomfortable then. Makes more sense now, knowing the family history of obsession with Apache treasures." "And you believe my account, then?" "I've read the documentation Miss Redhorse gathered during her department investigation," Callahan replied. "Warren Hargrove's attack on the Red Fox Apache village violated direct orders from Territorial Command. The official record was subsequently altered to justify his actions, but the original documents still exist in department archives." He glanced at Blackwell. "Your desertion may have violated military code, but your testimony regarding Hargrove's true motives aligns with evidence we've long suspected but couldn't prove." The validation of his 15-year-old choice eased something in Blackwell that had remained tightly guarded for decades, not erasing the moral complexity of his actions, but acknowledging the legitimate ethical foundation beneath them. They reached the ridge by mid-morning, establishing position on a rocky outcropping that provided clear view of the approaches from town. Below, they could see the consortium party making steady progress along the main trail, at least 20 men, as Thornton had reported, well equipped for both mining exploration and potential confrontation. "Professional security personnel," Callahan observed through field glasses, "not just local guns for hire. The consortium is investing significantly in this operation." They're following the most direct route to the ridge's southwestern face, Thornton noted, where geological surveys showed the richest copper deposits. And within half a mile of the sacred cave's entrance, Blackwell added grimly, though they'd need Apache knowledge to find the exact location. Or detailed maps, Callahan suggested. After the incident with Callaway, we have to assume they've gathered whatever intelligence was available. The consortium employs former military surveyors who specialized in mapping tribal territories. The implication was clear: the sacred cave might not remain secret much longer, regardless of tribal protections. The urgency of their situation intensified as the consortium party established a base camp at the foot of the ridge and began unloading equipment, including drills and explosives for preliminary mining exploration. By noon, the time Judge Mitchell's hearing was scheduled to begin. In town, Reed had not yet arrived with deputies, nor had Elena returned with Running Wolf's warriors. The consortium's operations continued unimpeded, with survey teams beginning to ascend the lower slopes of the ridge toward areas Blackwell knew were dangerously close to the sacred cave's hidden entrance. "We can't wait any longer," Blackwell decided, checking his rifle. "Even without official backing, we need to delay them until reinforcements arrive. Confronting them directly with just the three of us would be unwise," Callahan cautioned. "They outnumber us significantly and appear well armed." "Not confrontation," Blackwell clarified. "Distraction and delay. I learned a few things about Apache ghost tactics during my years here, ways to create uncertainty without direct engagement." Thornton, despite his injuries, nodded agreement. "I can circle around to the eastern approach. Creating the impression of movement from multiple directions would increase their caution." Callahan considered their limited options and the imminent threat to evidence crucial for the hearing. "Very well," he conceded. "But no direct provocation. We're buying time, not starting a conflict." They separated to implement their delaying tactics. Blackwell taking the western approach, Thornton the eastern, while Callahan maintained central observation to coordinate their efforts. Using techniques he had observed from Apache warriors during his years in the territory, Blackwell created the impression of movement among the rocks and trees, dislodging small stones to clatter down slopes, breaking branches in patterns that suggested multiple observers, mimicking bird calls that carried unnatural patterns to experienced frontiersmen. The strategy proved immediately effective. The consortium's security personnel grew visibly alert, pausing their advance up the ridge to establish defensive positions. Survey teams were pulled back to the main camp as guards spread out to investigate the perceived threats surrounding them. From his vantage point, Blackwell could see similar results from Thornton's efforts. On the Eastern Approach Consortium, men diverted from their primary mission to respond to phantom movements in the underbrush. The mining engineers, clearly frustrated by the security concerns interrupting their work, engaged in heated discussion with the lead guards. The delay tactics brought them nearly an hour before the consortium's leader, a sharp-featured man in expensive frontier clothing, gathered his security team for new instructions. Through field glasses, Blackwell could see the man gesturing emphatically toward the ridge, overriding apparent objections from his security personnel. "They're preparing to move forward regardless of perceived threats," Callahan observed, having rejoined Blackwell at his position. "Deadline pressure from San Francisco, most likely. The hearing in town has them concerned." Indeed, the consortium party began reorganizing security personnel, forming a protective perimeter around the survey team as they prepared to ascend the ridge once more, this time with greater determination despite their evident unease. "We've done what we can," Blackwell acknowledged. "Without reinforcements, we can't stop their advance much longer without direct confrontation." "Which would legally complicate everything," Callahan agreed. Even with my federal authority interfering with mining exploration on public lands requires specific jurisdiction I haven't been formally granted for this case. The consortium's advance resumed, moving more cautiously, but with clear intent toward the southwestern face, where their preliminary drilling would begin. Blackwell calculated they would reach the vicinity of the sacred cave within 30 minutes, potentially discovering its entrance through their systematic exploration of the ridge features. Then, as the situation appeared most dire, they heard the distinctive sound of multiple horses approaching from the direction of town. Not just a few riders, but a substantial party moving with coordinated purpose. From around the bend in the main trail appeared Sheriff Reed, at the head of a remarkable procession. Behind him rode his deputies as expected, but they were outnumbered by the Apache warriors who accompanied them, at least 15 tribal representatives led by Running Wolf, all wearing makeshift badges pinned to their traditional garments. Most surprising of all was the figure riding beside Reed Elena Redhorse, but transformed from her usual practical frontier clothing. She wore formal Apache ceremonial attire, her hair adorned with eagle feathers, face painted with traditional symbols that emphasized her tribal authority. Yet pinned to her ceremonial dress was something unprecedented, a Department of Interior badge that gleamed in the midday sun. The consortium party halted their advance, clearly startled by this unexpected development. Their leader stepped forward, as Reed approached, his expression betraying irritation beneath forced civility. "Sheriff Reed," he acknowledged stiffly, "what brings the county law enforcement to our legitimate mining exploration?" Reed dismounted with deliberate care, his manner calm but authoritative. "Mr. Bentley, I presume your reputation precedes you." He nodded toward the mining equipment being positioned on the slope. "This isn't legitimate exploration. Judge Mitchell has issued a temporary injunction against any mining activities in this area, pending today's hearing on tribal boundary claims." Bentley, the consortium's lawyer, whom Callahan had mentioned earlier, displayed the confident dismissal of someone accustomed to outmaneuvering local authorities. "We received no such injunction, Sheriff, and in its absence, the Mining Act of 1872 gives us clear rights to explore potential claims on public lands." He gestured toward the Apache warriors with obvious disdain. "Your unusual deputies notwithstanding." "The injunction was issued at 10 o'clock this morning," Reed replied evenly. "Perhaps you were already en route and missed its delivery to your hotel. Regardless, it is now being formally served." He held out an official document bearing the territorial court seal. Bentley made no move to accept it. "This ridge has never been formally recognized as Apache territory in any enforceable legal sense. The original treaties were superseded by subsequent territorial arrangements." "That's precisely the matter before Judge Mitchell's court today," came Elena's voice as she guided her horse forward. Her presence commanded attention, the combination of traditional Apache authority and federal credentials creating a powerful symbolic representation of the jurisdictional intersection at stake. "Miss Redhorse," Bentley acknowledged his tone, suggesting familiarity with her reputation. "I understood you were presenting evidence at the hearing. Yet, here you are rather conspicuously absent from those proceedings." "The hearing has been postponed until 4 o'clock, Elena informed him. "When Judge Mitchell learned of your expedition, he recognized it for what it is, an attempt to establish physical presence before legal rulings could prevent it." Her expression remained composed, but her voice carried unmistakable authority. "He specifically extended the injunction to cover any activities within 1 mile of this ridge." Blackwell and Callahan had descended from their observation point to join the confrontation, creating a united front of local tribal and federal representatives against the consortium's incursion. Bentley assessed this alignment of forces with the calculation of a strategist recognizing an unexpected obstacle. Even if such an injunction exists, he countered smoothly. It would require proper definition of boundaries to be enforceable. The exact lines of tribal claims remain disputed, precisely why we're conducting preliminary surveys to establish geological facts relevant to those determinations. The boundaries are not in dispute, Elena stated firmly. She turned to Running Wolf, who approached carrying an object wrapped in ceremonial hides. With solemn dignity, the elder unwrapped the package, revealing a gleaming silver object that caught the midday sun with startling brilliance. Murmurs rippled through both the consortium men and the gathered deputies as the shield of justice was displayed publicly for the first time in generations. Its intricate symbols, clearly ancient yet precisely crafted, formed patterns that even the uninitiated could recognize as significant. "The shield of justice," Elena announced for all to hear. "Sacred to the Apache people for centuries, it marks the 7 boundary points of traditional Red Fox Apache territory." These same boundaries were formally recognized in the Treaty of 1851. She gestured toward the ridge where they stood. This ridge is the 3rd boundary marker clearly identified both on the shield and in the original treaty documentation. Bentley's expression betrayed momentary surprise before his professional composure reasserted itself. "An interesting artifact, certainly, but hardly definitive legal evidence of territorial claims that would supersede established mining rights. That determination lies with Judge Mitchell and federal authorities," Callahan interjected, stepping forward to display his marshal's credentials. "Federal Marshal Robert Callahan. This area is now under federal protection pending formal boundary determinations. Your mining exploration is suspended until legal proceedings are completed." The combination of local, tribal, and federal authority presented Bentley with a formidable challenge. His security personnel looked to him for direction, clearly uncomfortable with the evolving situation. After calculating consideration, the lawyer made his decision. "We'll withdraw pending clarification from territorial authorities," he conceded, though his tone suggested this was tactical retreat rather than surrender. "But be advised, the consortium will pursue all legal remedies against this interference with legitimate mining activities." "As is your right," Reed acknowledged, "just as it's our right to enforce legal injunctions against unauthorized operations on disputed lands." Under the watchful eyes of deputies and warriors, the consortium began packing their equipment, preparing for withdrawal to town, where Bentley would undoubtedly begin immediate legal countermeasures. The sacred cave remained undiscovered, the boundary markers intact, but all present recognized this as merely the first skirmish in what would be an extended legal battle. As the consortium departed, Elena approached Blackwell, the shield of justice now rewrapped, and returned to Running Wolf's care. In her ceremonial attire, with the authority of both her tribal heritage and federal position evident in her bearing, she seemed transformed from the young woman who had shared coffee on his porch that morning. "You're wearing a department badge," Blackwell observed, noting the silver shield pinned to her ceremonial dress. "Official field appointment," Elena confirmed. "Marshal Callahan's recommendation approved by telegraph from the territorial office." A slight smile touched her lips. Apparently unprecedented, the first tribal representative with federal enforcement authority in territorial history. "Fitting," Blackwell commented, "the shield-bearer becoming a shield of a different kind." "Different form, same purpose," she agreed. "Protection of boundaries that matter." Running Wolf joined them, his weathered face displaying the satisfaction of a strategic victory, however temporary. "The shield of justice has witnessed justice again today," he observed, "as it was meant to do from the beginning." Callahan approached, having completed discussion with Reed regarding the legal documentation of the consortium's attempted incursion. "This is just the beginning," he cautioned. "Bentley will challenge every aspect of today's proceedings, the validity of the injunction, the deputizing of tribal members, the jurisdiction of federal authorities on territorial matters. "Let him," Elena replied with quiet confidence. "Each challenge creates legal record and precedent regarding tribal boundaries and rights. Win or lose individual motions, the larger recognition of Apache claims enters territorial jurisprudence." Blackwell recognized the strategy, using the consortium's own legal maneuvers to establish the tribal presence in territorial law that had been previously ignored or actively suppressed. It was sophisticated legal thinking that reflected Elena's unique position bridging two worlds. As they prepared to return to town for the rescheduled hearing, Thornton approached, having rejoined the group during the confrontation with the consortium. Despite his injuries, he had performed his role in their delaying tactics with unexpected effectiveness. "You handled yourself well out there, Doctor," Blackwell acknowledged. "Not many men would volunteer for such duty while still recovering." Thornton shrugged, then winced slightly at the movement of his injured shoulder. "My father would say healing happens fastest when focusing on something beyond oneself." A wry smile touched his face, though he might question my choice of activities. "What will you do when this is resolved?" Blackwell asked, noting how the young doctor had transformed from Hargrove's reluctant accomplice to active ally in their cause. "Rebuild my practice properly," Thornton replied without hesitation. "The way Father intended serving people rather than profit." He glanced toward town. "The community needs a physician who remembers their humanity comes before their utility." The simple declaration represented profound change, not just in Thornton's individual choices, but in the underlying values that would shape his future practice. It echoed larger transformations occurring throughout the community as divisions between settler and tribal interests began to dissolve in recognition of common humanity and shared connection to the contested land. By late afternoon, they had returned to town for Judge Mitchell's rescheduled hearing. The courthouse was filled beyond capacity, with settlers and tribal representatives crowded together in unprecedented proximity. The morning's events on the ridge had spread through both communities, creating an atmosphere of tense anticipation as legal proceedings that would affect all their futures were about to begin. Judge Mitchell entered the courtroom with the measured dignity of a man who understood the historical significance of the matters before him. In his 60s, with silver hair and penetrating eyes beneath bushy brows, he had served as territorial judge for over 15 years, earning respect for his impartiality and thoughtful application of frontier law. "This court will come to order," he announced, surveying the diverse gathering before him. "Today we address matters of territorial boundaries, treaty rights, and mining claims that have implications beyond the specific parties involved." He fixed his gaze on the legal representatives from both sides. "I expect these proceedings to establish precedent that will guide similar determinations throughout the territory. Bear that responsibility in mind as you present your arguments." Bentley rose first, immaculately dressed in a tailored suit that seemed calculated to emphasize the contrast between corporate sophistication and frontier governance. His presentation was masterful, acknowledging tribal history while systematically undermining its legal standing, citing mining laws and territorial statutes that favored development interests, questioning the evidentiary value of tribal artifacts against documented economic potential. When Elena's turn came, she approached the presentation differently. Rather than matching Bentley's abstract legal arguments, she made the case personal and specific, presenting photographs of the Shield of Justice, alongside the original treaty documents, demonstrating how the ancient symbols aligned precisely with geographical features mentioned in the 1851 agreement, bringing forward tribal elders to testify about traditional boundaries maintained for generations before written documentation existed. Most powerfully, she called Blackwell to testify about his 15 years as keeper of the shield, establishing continuity of protection that bridged tribal tradition and territorial law. His account of receiving the shield from the dying chief, maintaining it through decades of frontier change, and returning it to its rightful guardians when the shield-bearer came of age, resonated through the courtroom in ways purely legal arguments could not. Marshal Callahan provided federal perspective, presenting department policy regarding tribal treaties and the ongoing review of territorial arrangements that had systematically disadvantaged Native peoples. His testimony established federal interest in enforcing original treaty boundaries, where documentation supported tribal claims, a significant departure from previous territorial practices. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Mitchell listened with thoughtful attention, occasionally interrupting for clarification, but primarily allowing both sides to present their fullest case. By early evening, as final arguments concluded, the courtroom remained packed, despite the late-hour recognition that history was being made in this frontier courthouse. "I will not render immediate judgment on matters of such complexity and significance," Judge Mitchell announced as proceedings concluded. "Both sides have presented substantial evidence and legal argument that requires careful consideration. This court will recess for 3 days, during which time the temporary injunction against mining activities in the disputed areas remains in effect." Though not the definitive victory either side had hoped for, the continuation of the injunction represented important protection for the sacred cave and tribal boundaries while legal deliberations continued. As the courtroom emptied, Elena joined Blackwell on the courthouse steps, both physically and emotionally drained from the day's events. 3 days, she mused, watching as townspeople and tribal representatives dispersed into the evening streets, no longer strictly separated, but mingling in small conversational groups as they discussed the unprecedented proceedings they had witnessed. Bentley will use that time to bring additional pressure from territorial officials and mining interests. "And we'll use it to strengthen documentation of the treaty boundaries," Blackwell replied. Running Wolf has agreed to guide Callahan to the remaining 6 boundary markers identified on the shield, creating federal records that support tribal claims. Elena nodded, recognizing the strategy's value. A partnership between tribal knowledge and federal authority that Bentley can't easily dismiss. She studied the mingling communities with thoughtful assessment. Something is changing here beyond the specific legal questions. People who never spoke to each other are finding common ground. Indeed, the courthouse steps presented a remarkable tableau. Peterson, the blacksmith, deep in conversation with a tribal craftsman about metalworking techniques. Mrs. Henderson explaining frontier preservation methods to Apache women. Children from both communities playing together at the edges of adult gatherings. Small interactions, perhaps, and insignificant individually, but collectively representing shifts in understanding that legal proceedings alone could never achieve. The shield's purpose was never just about marking physical boundaries, Blackwell observed quietly. Running Wolf said it represents justice itself, the proper relationship between people and land, between different peoples sharing the same territory. Balance, Elena agreed. Not dominance of one over another, but recognition of each having legitimate place and purpose. As twilight deepened into evening, they made their way back to Blackwell's ranch, both too exhausted for further discussion of the day's events. The night wrapped around the house like a protective blanket, the stars wheeling overhead as they had for countless generations before territorial disputes and mining claims complicated human relationship with the ancient landscape. Morning found them on the porch again, coffee in hand, watching dawn transform the eastern mountains from shadowed silhouettes to golden majesty. Neither had slept well, the weight of pending decisions and uncertain futures disturbing their rest. Yet the new day brought fresh perspective, as it often did in this land of harsh contrasts and sudden beauty. "I've been offered a permanent position with the department," Elena said, after comfortable silence. Assistant Commissioner for Tribal Relations, based in Washington. The announcement settled between them like a stone dropped in still water, ripples of implication spreading outward. Blackwell absorbed it without visible reaction, though something tightened briefly around his heart. Important work, he acknowledged. They'd be fortunate to have your perspective. Elena studied him over her coffee cup, reading more than he had spoken. It would mean leaving the territory, she added, watching his response. Establishing tribal advocacy at the highest levels of federal governance. When would you need to decide? They've requested an answer within the month. She set her cup aside, turning to face him directly. But decisions of this magnitude deserve careful consideration, particularly when they affect more than one life. The implication hung between them, acknowledgement of the connection that had formed during their shared struggles, transcending their initial alliance of necessity. At 71 and 27, from worlds long divided by history and prejudice, they represented an unlikely partnership that defied conventional understanding, yet had proven remarkably effective. You should accept, Blackwell said finally. Your abilities and knowledge are needed there, where policy affecting all tribal nations is formed. And what of the work here? Elena asked. The treaty boundaries, the mining claims, the emerging relationship between communities, these require continued attention. Others can carry that forward, Blackwell suggested, though without full conviction. Running Wolf Reed, even Thornton, in his way. The foundation has been established. Elena rose, moving to the porch railing to gaze toward the mountains where the sacred cave held the shield of justice. Foundations require continued building to create lasting structures, she observed. And some partnerships cannot be easily replaced. The simplicity of this truth settled between them, recognition that what they had created together transcended individual contribution or professional alliance. Their complementary strengths, perspectives, and experiences had formed something unique, effective in ways neither could achieve alone. There is another possibility, Elena continued after thoughtful silence. The department has proposed establishing a Western Regional Office for Tribal Affairs with jurisdiction throughout the territories. It would require frequent travel between Washington and the field, but would be based here in the territory. And who would lead such an office? Blackwell asked, though he already knew the answer. They've offered me the position as alternative to the Washington appointment. She turned back to him, her expression earnest. It would mean remaining here, building on what we've started, while still influencing federal policy regarding tribal lands throughout the West. The possibility settled between them not just professional continuity, but personal as well. The home they had shared these past weeks could become permanent arrangement, their partnership extending beyond the immediate crisis to longer-term transformation of territorial relationships. Which would you prefer? Blackwell asked, careful not to influence her choice with his own preferences. Elena's smile held gentle understanding of his deliberate neutrality. I've spent my life between worlds, Blackwell, learning to navigate both, finding strength in the combination rather than choosing one over the other. She moved closer, her presence warm in the morning light. The regional position allows me to continue that path, connecting tribal wisdom with federal authority, traditional knowledge with modern governance, and continuing our work together. Blackwell acknowledged, allowing his preference to show at last. Yes, Elena confirmed simply. Continuing what we've begun here, not just protection of boundaries, but creation of new possibilities between peoples long divided. The decision wasn't formally declared, but understanding passed between them, recognition of shared path forward that honored both their professional alliance and the deeper connection that had formed through shared purpose and mutual respect. At their ages and positions, He a 71-year-old settler with complicated past, she a 27-year-old Apache leader with promising future certain possibilities, remained unspoken yet mutually acknowledged. The next 3 days passed in continuous activity. Callahan and Running Wolf documenting the remaining boundary markers identified on the Shield of Justice Elena, organizing testimonies from both tribal elders and settler witnesses regarding traditional land usage. Blackwell providing detailed accounts of his 15 years as Shield Keeper to establish continuity of tribal presence despite forced relocations. When Judge Mitchell reconvened court on the 4th day, the courthouse was once again filled beyond capacity. The atmosphere had shifted subtly, less division between tribal and settler sections, more intermingling of communities united by common interest in determinations that would affect all their futures. The judge entered with the same measured dignity as before, but those who knew him well noted a certain resolution in his bearing that suggested decisions had been reached after careful deliberation. He surveyed the assembled gathering before beginning his ruling. This court has considered extensive evidence and legal arguments regarding tribal boundaries, treaty rights, and mining claims in the disputed territories. He began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. The matters before us touch fundamental questions of justice, sovereignty, and relationship between peoples who must share this land, regardless of our determinations today. He gestured toward the legal documents arrayed before him. The Western Mining Consortium claims rights under the Mining Act of 1872, while tribal representatives assert prior claims under the Treaty of 1851. Both present compelling legal arguments within their respective frameworks. Bentley's expression remained professionally neutral, though tension showed in his posture, as he awaited the ruling that would either validate his client's claims or create precedent-setting limitations on mining interests throughout the territory. After careful review of all evidence presented, Mitchell continued, "This court finds that the original boundaries established in the Treaty of 1851 remain legally valid where they can be definitively documented. The Shield of Justice, in conjunction with federal survey verification, provides such documentation for the 7 boundary markers of traditional Red Fox Apache territory." A murmur passed through the courtroom, recognition of unprecedented validation of tribal claims based on both traditional artifacts and federal confirmation. Mitchell raised his hand for silence before continuing. However, this court also recognizes legitimate mineral development interests under territorial governance. Therefore, we establish the following framework. Mining operations may proceed outside the 1-mile protective boundary surrounding each of the 7 markers identified on the Shield of Justice. Within those protected areas, no development may occur without formal tribal consultation and federal oversight. The ruling represented neither complete victory nor defeat, for either side a carefully balanced determination that acknowledged both tribal sovereignty and territorial development interests. Most significantly, it established formal recognition of the Shield of Justice as legally valid documentation of boundaries that had been systematically ignored for generations. Furthermore, Mitchell added, this court recommends establishment of a permanent tribal consultation commission for all future development affecting traditional territories. Such commission shall include representation from tribal leadership, territorial authorities, and federal oversight through the Department of Interior. As the judge concluded, his ruling reaction spread through the courtroom, subdued satisfaction from Elena and tribal representatives who had gained unprecedented legal recognition, measured disappointment from consortium lawyers who had lost exclusive access to valuable mineral deposits, thoughtful consideration from settlers who recognized new frameworks for coexistence emerging from these proceedings. Outside the courthouse afterward, Callahan approached Blackwell and Elena as they discussed implications of Mitchell's ruling. The department will support this framework as model for similar determinations throughout the territories, he informed them. Mitchell's balancing of interests while formally recognizing tribal boundaries creates precedent we can build upon. The consortium will appeal, Elena predicted. Certainly, Callahan agreed. But appeals take time during which these protective boundaries remain in effect, and each level of review creates further legal record of tribal rights that have been previously ignored. He smiled slightly. Sometimes justice advances most effectively through persistent documentation rather than dramatic victories. Speaking of documentation, he continued, turning specifically to Blackwell. The department has reviewed your testimony regarding events 15 years ago. Given the circumstances and subsequent verification of Colonel Hargrove's unauthorized actions, formal charges regarding your military separation will not be pursued. The simple statement represented resolution of legal jeopardy that had shadowed Blackwell for 15 years, not ceremonial exoneration, but practical acknowledgement that justice was better served by focusing on substantive tribal rights than technical military violations committed to prevent civilian casualties. What happens now? Blackwell asked the question encompassing not just legal proceedings, but the broader transformation occurring in relationships between communities long divided. Implementation, Elena replied. Converting Mitchell's ruling into practical governance, establishing the Consultation Commission, documenting additional traditional territories throughout the region, creating frameworks for balanced development that respects both cultural heritage and economic needs. The work ahead was substantial, extending far beyond the specific boundaries protected by the shield of justice to broader questions of how different peoples might share contested landscapes. Yet the foundation had been established: legal recognition of tribal presence, formal processes for consultation, unprecedented cooperation between communities previously defined by conflict. As afternoon light slanted across the town square, Blackwell observed the mingling of tribal members and settlers, no longer rigidly separated by invisible boundaries of custom and prejudice, but cautiously exploring new possibilities for shared future in this harsh but beautiful territory. Children played together without awareness of historical divisions, while adults engaged in tentative but genuine exchange of knowledge and experience across cultural lines, long thought impermeable. The shield's work continues, he observed quietly to Elena, beyond physical boundaries to the ones that truly matter. The ones in minds and hearts, she agreed, watching the scene with measured optimism. Those take longest to change, but matter most in the end. Running Wolf approached, having completed discussions with tribal representatives regarding implementation of the court's ruling. His weathered face carried the satisfaction of one who had witnessed history shift toward justice long deferred. The shield-bearer and shield-keeper, he acknowledged them both. Your paths joined for purpose beyond what either imagined at beginning. He gestured toward the mingling communities. Seeds planted now will grow through generations. As evening approached, they returned to Blackwell's ranch, the home rebuilt through unprecedented collaboration between settler and Apache, standing as physical embodiment of the new possibilities emerging throughout the territory. The porch that wrapped around three sides offered views in all directions: east toward tribal lands, west toward settler communities, encompassing both within single perspective that acknowledged their inseparable future. I've decided to accept the regional position, Elena said, as they settled into the familiar evening ritual of shared coffee and conversation. Building from here, rather than Washington, seems right path for what needs doing next. Blackwell nodded satisfaction, warming him more than the coffee in his hands. The shield-bearer remains to continue its work. With the shield-keeper beside her, Elena added her gaze, meeting his directly. If he chooses that path as well. The invitation remained appropriately undefined, respecting both their positions and the cultural complexities surrounding them, yet acknowledging the deeper connection that had formed through shared purpose and mutual respect. At 71 and 27, from worlds long divided, they represented unlikely alliance that defied conventional understanding, yet had proven remarkably effective. "Some paths once started have to be followed to their end," Blackwell replied, echoing words he had spoken weeks earlier when their journey together was just beginning. As darkness settled over the land, stars emerging in the vast desert sky, the debt of honor that had begun 15 years earlier with a dying child and a sacred shield had transformed into something neither could have anticipated, a foundation for justice that transcended personal obligation, extending to communities long divided by mistrust and conflict. The shield of justice rested once more in its sacred cave, its ancient symbols recording boundaries that now received legal recognition after generations of dismissal. Yet its true power continued through those who had carried it, the shield-bearer and shield-keeper, whose unexpected partnership had created possibilities for healing where only division had existed before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The consortium would pursue legal appeals and seek other avenues to access mineral wealth. Territorial officials would balance competing interests with varying degrees of wisdom and foresight. Communities long defined by separation would navigate unfamiliar terrain of cooperation and shared governance. But tonight, in the peaceful aftermath of hard-won progress, Blackwell and Elena could acknowledge what they had already accomplished, not just the defeat of immediate threats, but the creation of possibilities that hadn't existed before their paths crossed. The Shield Keeper and the Shield Bearer, their separate journeys now intertwined in ways that would continue to shape the landscape around them. The debt had been paid in full. What remained was something new, not obligation, but choice, not burden, but possibility. A foundation upon which both individuals and communities might build something neither had imagined possible. Before their paths crossed a future shaped by justice rather than power, by healing rather than division. And in that possibility lay the shield's greatest power after all.